Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that begins in a small, picturesque town in upstate New York. A place where the streets are quiet, where neighbors know each other by name, and where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. But as we've learned time and again, darkness can find its way into even the most peaceful corners of our world. Get comfortable. Settle into your pillows. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Tonight's story is about a mother named Michelle, a woman who loved her daughters more than anything in the world. It's about the subtle ways trust can be broken, and how years of manipulation can lead to an unthinkable act. So breathe slowly. And let's begin in the town of Corning, New York, where this story unfolds like a slow-moving river, dark and deep. Corning, New York, sits in the southern tier of the state. Nestled in the Finger Lakes region, it's the kind of town where autumn leaves carpet the sidewalks in shades of amber and gold, where the historic downtown feels frozen in a gentler time. The town takes its name from the glass company that made it famous, Corning Glass, a Fortune 500 company that brought prosperity and stability to the area for generations. In the late 1980s, when our story begins, Corning was a place where young couples could build a life together. The schools were good. The neighborhoods were safe. The Kemung River wound through the landscape like a silver thread, and on summer evenings, families would gather at the parks, children's laughter echoing across the grass. It was here that two teenagers fell in love. Michelle was 18 years old when she met Lloyd Noroder in 1989. He was 16, younger by 2 years. But there was something about him that drew her in. They were both students at the local high school, both bright and full of dreams for the future. Young love has a particular intensity, doesn't it? That feeling that the world begins and ends with the person beside you, that nothing else matters quite as much. They dated through high school. When they graduated, instead of drifting apart like so many young couples do, Michelle and Lloyd grew closer. In 1991, just 2 years after they met, they stood before their families and friends and made their vows. Michelle was 20, Lloyd was 18. They were married, ready to face the world together. The early years of their marriage followed a familiar pattern. They both enrolled in college, determined to build successful careers. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Shortly after finishing their college years, Michelle became pregnant with their first daughter. It was a joy, but also a responsibility that shifted everything. 2 years later, they welcomed a second daughter. And then, about 5 years after that, a third little girl joined the family. 3 daughters. 3 beautiful children who would become the center of Michelle's world. Lloyd found work as an engineer at Corning Glass, the company that had given the town its identity. It was good work, stable work, the kind of job that could support a family of 5. Michelle, meanwhile, found her calling in education. She worked as an English professor at a local community college, sharing her love of literature and language with her students. On the surface, everything looked perfect. A happy family in a safe town. A nice home on Dwight Avenue. 3 daughters growing up surrounded by love and opportunity. But inside the walls of the Nurier home, something else was growing too. Something dark and quiet and corrosive. Something that would take years to fully reveal itself. As the daughters grew older, the marriage between Michelle and Lloyd began to show its fractures. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when things started to fall apart. Perhaps it was always there, hidden beneath the surface. Perhaps it grew slowly, year by year, until the weight became too much to bear. Friends of Michelle would later recall that she seemed different when Lloyd was around. More cautious, more measured in her words. There were whispers, quiet observations that Lloyd was strict with the children. Some might say too strict. His parenting style bordered on the severe, a rigidness that could feel at times almost punishing. But the girls loved their father. Children have a way of normalizing whatever environment they grow up in, don't they? The rules that might seem harsh to outsiders become simply the way things are. And Lloyd, for all his strictness, was their father. He was present. He was involved in their lives. In 2008, when the youngest daughter was still quite small, Lloyd received a job offer that would change everything. It was a position in New Jersey, hours away from Corning, a career opportunity he felt he couldn't pass up. He wanted the family to move with him, to start fresh in a new place. Michelle said no. She had built a life in Corning. Her job was there. The girls were settled in their schools, surrounded by friends and familiar routines. The thought of uprooting everything, of leaving behind the only home her daughters had ever known, felt wrong to her, so they reached a compromise. Though compromise might be too generous a word for what happened next. Lloyd would take the job in New Jersey. Michelle and the girls would stay in Corning. The family would be separated, but it would be temporary. Or so Michelle hoped. What's interesting, what friends and family members noticed almost immediately, was how Michelle seemed to blossom in Lloyd's absence. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She smiled more easily. She laughed more freely. She seemed, for the first time in years, relaxed. Lloyd, too, seemed content with the distance. The separation gave him space, freedom, a life apart from the daily responsibilities of family. And it was during this time apart that he made a decision. He wanted a divorce. The word itself is simple, final, but divorce is never just one thing. It's 1,000 small deaths. The dismantling of the life you thought you'd have. For Michelle, it meant facing an uncertain future as a single mother of 3. For the girls, it meant watching their parents' marriage come to an end, trying to understand why the people who were supposed to love each other forever couldn't find a way to stay together. In 2013, the divorce was finalized. Michelle moved with the daughters into a new home in Corning, determined to create a stable, loving environment for them. The custody arrangement was split, though the details were complicated, always shifting, always a source of tension. Lloyd, living in New Jersey, wasn't content with the arrangement. He wanted more. He wanted full custody of the youngest daughter, Charlotte, who was still a child, still living primarily with Michelle, and he wanted to stop paying child support. He wanted to stop paying alimony. The financial obligations of the divorce felt, to him, like an unbearable burden. So he began to fight, not just in the way most divorced couples fight, with lawyers and court dates and tense negotiations. No, Lloyd's fight became something more, something consuming, something that would eventually spiral into obsession. Over the course of the next few years, Lloyd filed 26 separate post-divorce motions with the family court. 26. To put that in perspective, most divorced couples might file 2 or 3 such motions over the course of their entire lives. But Lloyd filed 26 in just a few years, each one challenging some aspect of the custody arrangement, each one demanding changes, each one costing money that he claimed he didn't have. Michelle's lawyers were stunned by the relentless barrage of legal challenges. It was harassment disguised as litigation, a way of keeping Michelle constantly on edge, constantly defensive, constantly drained by the emotional and financial toll of fighting him in court, again and again and again. And through it all, something else was happening. Something quieter, but perhaps even more insidious. Lloyd was working to turn the daughters against their mother. There's a term for what Lloyd was doing, a phrase that psychologists and family court judges have come to recognize, though it remains controversial and complex. It's called parental alienation. Parental alienation occurs when one parent systematically undermines the child's relationship with the other parent. It's a form of psychological manipulation, a slow erosion of trust and love. The alienating parent plants seeds of doubt. They share twisted versions of events. They cast themselves as the victim, and the other parent as the villain. Over time, over months and years, the child begins to see the targeted parent through this distorted lens. And the most heartbreaking part, the child often doesn't realize it's happening. The manipulation is subtle, coercive, wrapped in expressions of love and concern. The alienating parent might say things like, "Your mother doesn't really care about you," or, "If your mother loved you, she wouldn't do these things." or "I'm the only one who truly understands you." Small phrases, repeated often enough, can reshape a child's entire understanding of their family. Michelle saw it happening. She watched, powerless, as her relationship with her daughters began to change. The oldest daughter had already moved to live with Lloyd in New Jersey after the divorce. Carrie, the middle daughter, went off to college at the Rochester Institute of Technology in 2014 to study engineering. But even from a distance, Lloyd's influence remained strong. Michelle tried to fight back against the alienation, but how do you fight something so insidious? How do you prove to your children that they're being manipulated when the manipulator has convinced them that you're the liar? She attended court hearings, pleaded her case, documented the ways Lloyd was interfering with her relationship with the girls. But the legal system moved slowly, and Lloyd was always one step ahead, always filing another motion, always finding another way to tie her up in court. By 2017, Lloyd was drowning in debt. He owed over $100,000, much of it related to the child support and alimony payments he was required to make to Michelle. The lawyer's fees from his endless court filings had piled up as well. He was working as an engineer, earning a decent salary, but the financial obligations of the divorce had become, in his mind, unsustainable. And so Lloyd began to formulate a plan. A terrible, unthinkable plan. A plan that would free him from his financial burdens, that would give him custody of Charlotte, that would finally end his battles with Michelle, once and for all. He would kill her, but he wouldn't do it alone. He would need help. Someone he trusted, someone who was already under his control, someone who had been systematically alienated from Michelle over the course of years. He would ask Carrie. Carrie Neuroder was 19 years old in the summer of 2017. She was entering her fourth year at the Rochester Institute of Technology, studying engineering, following in her father's footsteps. By all accounts, she was a bright young woman with a promising future ahead of her. But Carrie had been living under her father's influence for years. After the divorce, she had spent significant time with Lloyd, listening to his version of events, absorbing his anger and resentment toward Michelle. The alienation had worked. Carrie's relationship with her mother had become strained, distant, complicated by feelings she couldn't fully articulate. In early August of 2017, Lloyd approached Carrie with a proposition. No, that's too gentle a word. It wasn't a proposition. It was an ultimatum. Lloyd told Carrie that he could no longer afford to pay child support and alimony to Michelle. He said the financial burden was destroying him, that he was drowning in debt, that he saw no way out. And then he presented Carrie with a choice. A horrific choice that no child should ever have to face. "Help me kill your mother," Lloyd said, "or I will kill myself." Imagine being 19 years old and hearing those words from your father. The person who raised you, who you've been conditioned to see as the victim in this story, who you've been taught to prioritize above all else, including your own mother. The person who is now threatening to end his own life unless you participate in murdering the woman who gave birth to you. It's an impossible choice. A cruel choice. A choice designed to manipulate and control. Carrie would later tell investigators that she felt trapped. She loved her father. Despite everything, despite the manipulation and the alienation, she still loved him. She had been conditioned to believe that her mother was the source of all their problems. That Michelle was the one causing her father pain. That removing Michelle from the equation would somehow solve everything. So Carrie made a choice. A choice she would come to regret for the rest of her life. She agreed to help. Late August in upstate New York is a beautiful time of year. The heat of summer has begun to fade, replaced by cooler evenings and the first hints of autumn in the air. It's a time when families might take one last trip before school starts again, when college students prepare to return to campus, when life feels balanced between the warmth of summer and the possibilities of fall. For Michelle, late August 2017 brought a rare moment of relief. Lloyd had failed to show up for a court appearance regarding his latest petition for sole custody of Charlotte. Because of his absence, the case was dismissed. After years of constant legal battles, Michelle had finally won a small victory. Friends remember her being happy during those final days. She took Charlotte and some friends to a local hill where they slid down the grass on large blocks of ice, laughing in the summer sun. For the first time in a long time, Michelle seemed to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind her. Maybe Lloyd would finally let go of his obsessive need to control and punish her. Maybe she could move forward with her life, focus on her daughters, find some peace. She had no idea what was coming. On Saturday, August 26th, Lloyd flew from New Jersey to Rochester, New York, ostensibly to help Carrie move into her new apartment near the RIT campus. It was a kind gesture, the sort of thing a caring father might do. Carrie had just started her 4th year, and moving can be stressful. Lloyd wanted to help, or at least that's what he told people. After helping Carrie settle into her apartment, Lloyd checked into a hotel nearby. Security footage from the hotel would later show Carrie arriving at the hotel that evening, getting into her car with her father beside her. The two of them drove away together, leaving the hotel parking lot sometime around 10 or 11 at night. They didn't return until the next morning. Where did they go? The answer is chilling in its simplicity. They drove from Rochester to Corning, a journey of about 100 miles, roughly an hour and a half if you take the highways through the dark countryside of upstate New York. They drove through small towns and farmland, past sleeping houses and empty roads, until they reached McCall's home on Dwight Avenue. The house was quiet when they arrived. Charlotte, Michelle's youngest daughter, was asleep in her room. Michelle was in her bedroom, unaware that her ex-husband and her daughter had just crept into her home in the dead of night. Lloyd and Carrie moved through the house carefully, methodically. They unplugged electronic devices, anything that might later reveal their presence through digital footprints or timestamps. And then Carrie went to distract Charlotte, keeping the 14-year-old occupied, keeping her away from what was about to happen upstairs. Lloyd went to Michelle's bedroom. We can only imagine what Michelle must have thought when she saw him standing there. Confusion, perhaps. Fear. The realization that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Did she have time to scream? Did she try to fight back? The details are brutal, and I'll spare you the most graphic aspects. But what we know is this. Lloyd strangled Michelle to death in her own bedroom. It didn't take long. Strangulation, as a method of murder, is personal and intimate. It requires the killer to be close, to feel the victim's struggle, to watch the life leave their eyes. It is in many ways the opposite of a crime of passion. It requires sustained effort, sustained intent. You can't strangle someone by accident. When it was done, when Michelle was dead, Lloyd called Carrie upstairs. Together, father and daughter staged the scene to make it look like suicide. They fashioned a rope into a noose, positioned Michelle's body, arranged everything to suggest that she had taken her own life. And then they left. They drove back to Rochester in the pre-dawn darkness, arriving at Lloyd's hotel just as the sun was beginning to rise. Lloyd checked out later that morning and boarded a plane to California, where he had scheduled a job interview. The timing was perfect. He would be on the other side of the country when Mikhail's body was discovered, giving him an alibi that seemed on the surface airtight. Carrie drove back to her apartment, where she tried to act as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't just participated in the murder of her own mother. Monday, August 28th, 2017, began like any other day in Corning. The sun rose over the quiet streets. People went to work. Children prepared for school. It was the kind of ordinary morning that makes what came next all the more jarring. A family friend arrived at Michelle's house that afternoon to pick up Charlotte for swim practice. It was a routine they'd established, the friend helping out with transportation. Michelle always grateful for the support, but when the friend arrived and looked through the glass panes in the front door, something was wrong. They could see a figure inside, motionless, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Or no, not standing. Hanging. The friend called 911, their voice shaking, trying to explain what they were seeing through the glass. The dispatcher sent police immediately. Sergeant John McDivitt was the first to arrive. He approached the front door, looked through those same glass panes, and saw what the friend had seen. Michelle Neurotter, 46 years old, mother of 3, hanging from a rope. The scene appeared to be a suicide. A tragic, devastating suicide. The kind of death that leaves a community reeling, wondering what signs they missed, what they could have done differently. Officers entered the home, confirmed that Michelle was deceased, and began the careful process of documenting the scene. But even in those first moments, something felt off. Police Chief Jeff Spaulding arrived and examined Michelle's body. There was a rope mark on her chin, a strange ligature pattern that didn't quite match what you'd expect from a hanging. It was, in Spaulding's words, unsettling. Michelle's mother, Jem Laundy, was notified of her daughter's death. The news was delivered with the gentleness such terrible information requires. But there's no easy way to tell a mother that her child is gone. Jen's reaction was immediate and certain. Her daughter did not commit suicide. Someone had killed her. And Jen had a pretty good idea who. Lloyd, she told police. Lloyd killed her. I don't know how, but he did it. The police were skeptical at first. Lloyd was in California, thousands of miles away, on a job interview. How could he have been involved? But they agreed to investigate. They would treat Matrell's death as suspicious until they could definitively rule out foul play. They began by interviewing the people closest to Michelle. They spoke with friends, with colleagues, with family members, and they spoke with Carrie, who was with Charlotte at her apartment in Rochester. Carrie told the police that she had visited her mother on Saturday evening, the night before Michelle was found. She said that Michelle had become upset, angry, accusing Carrie of taking Lloyd's side in the custody battles. Carrie claimed her mother was screaming out of control, and that she decided to leave, taking Charlotte with her to protect her younger sister from their mother's rage. It was a story designed to paint Michelle as unstable, as someone who might have been suicidal, but the police had questions. Why would Michelle be so upset on the same day she'd won a victory in court? Why would she rage at Carrie about something that had supposedly been resolved? The timeline didn't make sense, and then there were the physical details of the scene. The rope mark on Michelle's chin, the scratches on her face, the position of her body. The more closely the investigators looked, the more convinced they became that this was not a suicide. They requested a second opinion from the medical examiner. The examiner looked more carefully at Michelle's throat, at the damage that had been done. The injuries were not consistent with self-strangulation. They indicated the presence of another person. Someone who had applied force externally, someone who had strangled Michelle and then staged the scene to look like a suicide. It was murder. Once the death was officially ruled a homicide, the investigation shifted into a higher gear. Detectives began looking more carefully at everyone in Michelle's life, searching for anyone who might have had a motive to kill her. And the more they learned, the more their attention focused on Lloyd. Lloyd had motive. He owed Michelle over $100,000 in child support and alimony. He'd been fighting for years to gain custody of Charlotte. He'd filed 26 separate court motions, a pattern of obsessive, relentless legal harassment. Michelle's death would solve all of his problems. It would end the financial burden. It would give him custody. It would free him from the consequences of his divorce. But Lloyd had an alibi. He was in California when Michelle was killed. Security footage, plane tickets, hotel records. All of it seemed to confirm that he was thousands of miles away. Unless he wasn't. Detectives started digging into Lloyd's movements in the days leading up to Michelle's death. They discovered that before flying to California, Lloyd had made a stop in Rochester. He'd helped Carrie move into her apartment. He'd stayed at a hotel, and that's when investigators found the security footage. The hotel cameras showed Lloyd leaving with Carrie late Saturday night. They didn't return until early Sunday morning, just hours before Lloyd's flight to California. Where had they gone? The hotel was about 100 miles from Corning, an hour-and-a-half drive each way. Plenty of time to make the trip there and back in a single night. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the police needed more. They needed proof that Lloyd and Carrie had been in Michelle's home. They needed evidence that could hold up in court. So they made a decision that would ultimately break the case wide open. They obtained a warrant to wiretap Carrie's phone. For months, the investigation moved slowly. The police gathered evidence, built their case. But they needed something definitive. Something that would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lloyd and Carrie were responsible for Michelle's death. In mid-November, 2.5 months after the murder, investigators activated the wiretap on Carrie's phone. At first, the conversations between father and daughter were unremarkable. Casual chit-chat about school, about daily life. Nothing that revealed any guilt or involvement in Michelle's death. But then the police decided to take a more active approach. They used a technique called tickle the wire, a strategy designed to provoke a response. An investigator called Carrie, saying they had more questions about her mother's death, that they'd like to meet with her to discuss some new developments in the case. The call was designed to make Carrie nervous, to make her reach out to her father for guidance. And it worked. Shortly after the investigator's call, Carrie called Lloyd. The wiretap recorded every word. Carrie was panicking. She told Lloyd that the police wanted to talk to her again, that she didn't know what to say, that she was scared she would say the wrong thing. And Lloyd, calm and controlled, gave her instructions. "Tell them you have a counseling appointment in New Jersey," he said. "Tell them this has been really hard on you. Tell them you need to get back to campus." And then, with a laugh in his voice, Lloyd asked, "Could you cry?" Carrie responded, "I might." It was a chilling moment, captured forever on tape. A father instructing his daughter on how to manipulate the police, how to fake emotions, how to lie convincingly about the murder they'd committed together. The laughter in Lloyd's voice revealed something deeply disturbing. He didn't just see this as survival. On some level, he was enjoying it. The manipulation, the control, the game of outwitting the investigators. But Lloyd didn't know he was being recorded. He didn't know that every word he spoke was being documented, analyzed, used to build a case against him. The wiretap provided the evidence investigators needed. Combined with the hotel security footage, the inconsistencies in Carrie's original story, and the physical evidence from the crime scene, the police had enough to make their arrests. In January 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's death, warrants were issued for Lloyd and Carrie Neuroder. Carrie was arrested at her apartment in Rochester. She was 20 years old by then, just a few months past her 19th birthday when she'd participated in her mother's murder. The police arrived early in the morning, knocked on her door, and took her into custody without incident. She didn't resist. She didn't try to run. In some ways, there must have been a relief in finally being caught, and no longer having to carry the weight of what she'd done. Lloyd's arrest was more dramatic. When police located him in New Jersey, he was on the top floor of a 5-story parking garage in Princeton. He'd led them on a chase through the city streets before ending up there, standing at the edge, threatening to jump. It was a final act of manipulation, a desperate attempt to control the narrative one last time. But the officers weren't going to let him escape. As Lloyd stood at the edge of the parking garage, one officer rushed forward and tackled him, pulling him back from the ledge. Lloyd was subdued, handcuffed, and taken into custody. The charges were severe. Lloyd was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree custodial interference, and second-degree conspiracy. Carrie faced charges of second-degree murder, first-degree custodial interference, tampering with physical evidence, and second-degree conspiracy. Both father and daughter were held without bail. The media coverage was intense. The story of a father manipulating his daughter into helping murder her mother captured national attention. People couldn't understand it. How could a parent do this? How could a child participate in killing their own mother? The case raised uncomfortable questions about parental alienation, about the power dynamics in families, about the ways manipulation can warp a person's sense of right and wrong. In October 2018, Lloyd Neuroder stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, first-degree custodial interference, and second-degree conspiracy. He admitted, in open court, that he had planned and executed Michelle's murder. He admitted that he had manipulated Carrie into helping him. During his statement to the court, Lloyd addressed Michelle's family. He said he understood the consequences of his actions. He apologized, though the apology felt hollow, inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. His defense attorney tried to paint a picture of a man who loved his daughters, who was at peace with his fate, but the facts spoke for themselves. Lloyd had murdered his ex-wife to avoid paying child support. He had manipulated his daughter into participating in the crime. He had spent months trying to outwit the police, lying and scheming even as Michelle's family grieved. On December 4th, 2018, Lloyd Neuroder was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again to walk free. Carrie's case was more complex. She had initially been charged with second-degree murder, but the district attorney, Brooks Baker, believed that Carrie had been a victim herself. Not in the same way Michelle was a victim, but a victim nonetheless of years of psychological manipulation and abuse. Baker argued that Carrie suffered from parental alienation syndrome, that Lloyd had systematically destroyed her relationship with Michelle, had twisted her perception of reality, had coerced her into participating in the murder through threats of suicide. The judge agreed. Carrie was allowed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison. The sentence was controversial. Some people believed Carrie deserved much more time, that at 19 years old she was old enough to know that murder was wrong, that she should have gone to the police instead of helping her father. Others believed the sentence was appropriate, that Carrie had been brainwashed, that she needed help and rehabilitation, not punishment. Michelle's mother, Jan Lundy, wrote a letter to the judge before Carrie's sentencing. In it, she said she didn't blame her granddaughter. She believed Lloyd had manipulated Carrie, had taken a vulnerable young woman and turned her into an unwilling accomplice. Jan wrote that she didn't believe Michelle would have wanted a long prison sentence for her daughter. It was an act of extraordinary grace and forgiveness, the kind that's difficult to comprehend from the outside looking in. Carrie was sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for women in Westchester County. She served approximately 1 year before being released on parole in January 2020. She was 22 years old when she walked out of prison, trying to rebuild a life shattered by her father's manipulations and her own terrible choices. The youngest daughter, Charlotte, was placed in foster care following the arrests. At just 14 years old, she had lost her mother to murder, and both her father and sister to prison. The other two daughters had to grapple with the reality that their father had killed their mother, that their sister had helped him do it. The trauma rippled outward, touching everyone who had known the Neuroter family. Friends struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the monstrous acts that had been committed. How do you make sense of it? How do you understand how love can be twisted into something so dark? Jean Lundy became Charlotte's guardian, determined to help her youngest granddaughter heal from the unimaginable trauma she'd endured. Jean also made it her mission to preserve Michelle's memory, to tell her daughters the truth about who their mother really was. She wanted them to know that Michelle had loved them fiercely, had fought for them, had never stopped trying to protect them from Lloyd's influence. It's a truth that Carrie came to understand during her time in prison. Away from Lloyd's influence, she began to see the manipulation for what it was. She expressed deep regret for her role in her mother's death, acknowledging that she had been wrong, that she had allowed herself to be used as a weapon against someone who had only ever wanted to love her. Whether that remorse is enough, whether it can ever be enough, is not for any of us to say. Some wounds cut too deep to ever fully heal. Lloyd Neurotter remains in prison, currently housed at the Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York. He will die there, his life reduced to the confines of a cell, his legacy one of violence and manipulation. Michelle is buried in Corning, the town she loved, the town where she raised her daughters. Her friends remember her as kind, generous, always willing to help others. They remember her smile, her warmth, her dedication to her children. They remember a woman who deserved so much better than the hand life dealt her. The case of Michelle Neuroter raises questions that don't have easy answers, about the power of manipulation, about the long-term effects of parental alienation, about the choices we make when faced with impossible situations. It's tempting to view Carrie as simply a villain, someone who made a conscious choice to participate in her mother's murder. But the reality is more complicated. Parental alienation is a form of emotional abuse, a systematic destruction of a child's bond with one parent. It can be as damaging as physical abuse, warping a person's sense of reality, their understanding of love and loyalty. Does that excuse what Carrie did? No. Nothing can excuse participating in the taking of another person's life, especially your own mother. But it does provide context for how a 19-year-old woman could have been drawn into something so terrible. The real villain in this story is Lloyd, a man who, rather than accept the consequences of his divorce, chose to murder the mother of his children. A man who manipulated his daughters for years, turning them against Michelle, using them as pawns in his bitter custody battle. A man who threatened suicide to coerce his teenage daughter into helping him commit murder. And in the end, what did Lloyd gain? Nothing. He's in prison for life. His daughters' lives are forever scarred. Michelle is gone. There are no winners in this story, only loss and tragedy, and the long, slow work of trying to heal from something that can never fully be undone. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Michelle. Think about a mother who loved her daughters, who fought for them, who never stopped trying to protect them. Think about the fragility of family bonds, the importance of trust, the damage that manipulation can cause, and maybe, just maybe, hold a little closer the people you love. Tell them what they mean to you. Be honest in your relationships. Choose kindness over cruelty, forgiveness over resentment, because in the end, that's all we have. Each other, the moments we share, the love we give and receive. Everything else, all the anger and bitterness and need for control, it fades into nothing. It leads nowhere good. Michelle and her auteur deserved better. She deserved to watch her daughters grow up, to see them graduate college, to be a grandmother someday. She deserved a life free from fear and harassment, and the relentless cruelty of the man she once loved. We can't give her that life back, but we can remember her. We can tell her story. We can learn from what happened to her family, and we can go to sleep tonight, grateful for the people in our lives who love us truly, who would never hurt us, who choose every day to be better. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're going to explore a story from the English countryside. A tale of deception, desperation, and ultimately justice. We journey back to 1984, to a small village in the Cotswolds, where nothing ever seemed to happen until it did. The village of Horton sits nestled in the rolling hills of South Gloucestershire, in the heart of England's Cotswolds. It's the kind of place that seems frozen in time. A place where roughly 350 souls live out their quiet lives among farmhouses and fields. There's a single road winding through the village, a modest village hall, and not even a pub to speak of. The countryside here is so beautiful, so unspoiled, that it's protected by law. In 1979, a man named Graham Backhouse inherited Widden Hill Farm from his father. Graham was 43 years old by 1984, a former hairdresser who had traded scissors and styling for sheep and pastures. He lived there with his wife, Margaret, who was 37, and their 2 children. On the surface, they seemed like any other farming family in this peaceful corner of England. But beneath the pastoral calm, something was stirring. Graham Backhouse was not a natural farmer. While he may have been skilled with hair, he struggled with livestock and land. The farm his father had left him was slowly slipping through his fingers. By the spring of 1984, Graham found himself drowning in debt, £70,000, a staggering sum at the time. The weight of it pressed down on him, day after day, as he walked the fields and tended the sheep. And Graham had another problem. He was not faithful to his wife. His affairs were something of an open secret in the small village, whispered about in hushed tones. He'd been involved with several women in the area, including the wives of men he knew, and even a young shepherdess who worked on a neighboring farm. In a community as tight-knit as Horton, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where, as one local put it, they all knew each other very well. Some too well. Graham's behavior had not won him many friends. But Margaret seemed devoted to him. She was elegant, gentle, a good mother to their children. By all accounts, she loved her husband, despite his failings. In March of 1984, something strange began to happen at Widden Hill Farm. Graham reported to police that he'd been receiving threatening phone calls, dark, menacing calls that left him shaken. Then came the letters, handwritten notes warning him that he would come to harm. The threats escalated. On a quiet day in late March, one of Graham's farm workers made a disturbing discovery. Impaled on a fence post at the edge of the property was the severed head of a sheep. Its dead eyes stared out across the fields. Attached to the gruesome display was a note, the words scrawled in crude handwriting. "You next." Graham took the note to the police, his hands trembling as he handed it over. Someone was targeting him, he insisted. Someone wanted him dead. But the police weren't entirely sure what to make of it. Threatening notes and dead animals. It seemed theatrical, almost staged. Still, they took the report and filed it away. And then on the 9th of April, 1984, everything changed. It was an ordinary morning. Margaret Backhouse needed to take the children to school and run some errands in town. Her own car wouldn't start, one of those small inconveniences that pepper everyday life. Graham, being the helpful husband, offered her his Volvo station wagon instead. Margaret thanked him, gathered her things, and walked out to the garage. She climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was cold against her legs. She inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The world exploded. A pipe bomb hidden beneath the driver's seat detonated with a deafening roar. The device contained nitroglycerine in roughly 4,500 shotgun pellets, the equivalent of 10 to 12 shotgun shells, all packed into a single explosive. The blast was devastating. Hundreds of pellets tore through Margaret's body, lacerating her buttocks, thighs, and lower back. The force of the explosion nearly severed her legs, but by an extraordinary stroke of luck, Margaret Backhouse survived. The Volvo had been manufactured for the harsh Scandinavian winters, and it came equipped with a metal-heated plate built into the driver's seat. That plate deflected much of the blast's force away from Margaret's vital organs. The bomb that should have killed her instantly instead left her grievously wounded, but alive. A neighbor, Susan, was nearby when she heard the explosion. She came running, shouting Margaret's name. Graham emerged from the milking shed. He'd been out of earshot of the blast. When he saw his wife's injuries, witnesses would later say he turned pale and began shaking violently. He ran into the farmhouse and called for an ambulance, then returned with a blanket to lay over Margaret's broken body. Through the pain and shock, Margaret managed to whisper to him, "Don't move me. Don't touch me." Margaret was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked for 7 hours to remove the embedded shrapnel and save what tissue they could. Meanwhile, police sealed off Widden Hill Farm. An Army bomb disposal unit was called in to clear the scene and ensure there were no other devices. Once they deemed it safe, police explosive experts began processing the wreckage of the Volvo. From the outside, the car looked almost normal, but beneath told a different story. The bomb had been meticulously wired to the car's fuse box and heater. The heater had been turned on full so that the moment Margaret turned the ignition key to the position, just before starting the engine, an electrical current would flow through the circuit and detonate the device. It was a crude bomb, but effective. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing. That same day, another letter arrived at Widden Hill Farm. The handwriting was rough, deliberately misspelled. Came twice last week, but the pigs were about to see you soon. The police now believed that Graham Backhouse was the target of a serious murder plot. They placed him under 24-hour protection, with officers stationed at the farm around the clock. Graham cooperated fully with the investigation, answering their questions with apparent openness. He had theories, he told them, about who might want to hurt him. He admitted his affairs, confessed them readily, almost proudly. Perhaps it was a jealous husband, he suggested. David Hodkinson, for instance. Graham had been involved with David's wife, Caroline, and David, conveniently, was an electrical engineer who had previously worked with explosives. He'd even done repair work on Graham's Volvo in the past. David Hodkinson seemed like the perfect suspect, but police went to question him, only to discover he'd been in Spain since before the explosion. Still, his absence from the area didn't necessarily rule him out. Perhaps he'd planted the bomb before his trip. The moment David returned home, police arrested him. For 2 days, they held him for questioning. They searched his property, examined his tools, scrutinized every aspect of his life, but they found nothing. No evidence whatsoever connecting David Hodkinson to the bomb. Reluctantly, they released him. Graham also pointed to another suspect, his neighbor Colin Bedell Taylor. Colin Bedell Taylor was 63 years old, a craftsman who lived on an adjacent property. He and Graham had been having a dispute over property boundaries, one of those tedious conflicts between neighbors that can fester for years. But there was something else. Colin's son Digby had died in a car accident in 1982. The loss had devastated Colin, left him somewhat withdrawn and erratic in his grief. Graham suggested to police that perhaps Colin blamed him for Digby's death in some way. Perhaps Colin's grief had twisted into something darker, something dangerous. The police investigated Colin Bedell Taylor. They found no evidence connecting him to the threats or the bombing, but they kept him on their radar. After all, the bomber was still out there somewhere, still dangerous. 9 days after the explosion, Graham made an unusual request. He asked that the 24-hour police guard be removed. It was too intrusive, he said, too disruptive to farm life. But he did accept an alternative, a panic button, installed in the farmhouse that would connect directly to the local police station if pressed. One push, and officers would be dispatched immediately. The police agreed to the arrangement, though some felt uneasy about leaving Graham unprotected. And so life at Widden Hill Farm settled into an uneasy rhythm. Margaret remained in the hospital, slowly recovering from her terrible injuries. Graham tended the farm and waited, the panic button nearby, a red emergency light in the darkness. On the 30th of April, 1984, just 3 weeks after the car bombing, the panic button was activated. Police Constable Richard Uden was among the first to arrive at Widden Hill Farm. What he found there would haunt him for years to come. In the kitchen at the foot of the stairs lay the body of Colin Bedell Taylor. He'd been shot twice in the chest at point-blank range with a shotgun. The blasts had killed him almost instantly. Clutched in his right hand was a Stanley knife, a utility blade with initials etched into the handle. And there, lying on the floor of the lounge, was Graham Backhouse. He was drenched in blood, slashed multiple times across the face and chest. Deep wounds gaped open, blood pooling beneath him. He was conscious but weak. His breathing labored. When the police managed to get Graham's story, it seemed to confirm their worst fears. Colin Bedell Taylor had come to the farm, Graham said. He'd told Graham he wanted to look at some furniture Graham was selling. Just a neighborly visit. But once inside, Colin had turned on him. He'd accused Graham of being responsible for his son Digby's death. And then Colin had confessed everything. He'd planted the car bomb. He'd written the threatening letters. He'd put the sheep's head on the fence. All of it. It had been Colin all along. And then Graham said, Colin had attacked him with the Stanley knife. He'd slashed at Graham's face, his chest, trying to kill him. Graham had fought back desperately, overturning furniture, struggling for his life. Finally, he'd managed to break away and grab his shotgun from where it was kept in the house. He'd pointed it at Colin, warned him to stop, but Colin had kept coming, so Graham had fired. Twice. In self-defense. It was a compelling story. It tied everything together neatly, the threats, the bombing, the attack. Colin Bedell Taylor, driven mad by grief, had tried to kill Graham and his wife, and now Colin was dead, shot down in what appeared to be a clear case of self-defense. But something didn't sit right with the investigating officers. Detective Constable Steph Burden was one of the officers who arrived at the scene that day. Years later, she would remember the blood, so much blood. But it was the pattern of the blood that troubled her. When someone is attacked with a knife, when there's a struggle, blood flies. It splatters across walls, flings off in arcs and streaks as the weapon moves through the air. Cast-off blood spatter, the forensic experts call it. It tells the story of violence in motion. But in Graham Backhouse's kitchen, the blood drops were round, perfectly circular. That meant the blood had dripped straight down, falling at a 90-degree angle to the floor. The person bleeding had been standing still, not struggling, not fighting. There was more. Blood was found under furniture that had supposedly been knocked over during the fight. That meant the blood had been there first, before the furniture was overturned. Someone had staged the scene, creating the appearance of a struggle after the blood had already been spilled. The police looked more closely at Graham's injuries. The deep slash across his chest was particularly suspicious. Dr. William Cannard, the pathologist who examined Graham, made a startling observation. That wound, he said, could only have been inflicted if Graham had stood perfectly still, if someone had been attacking him with a knife, if he'd been fighting for his life. His body would have recoiled, pulled back instinctively. The wound would have been deeper at the initial point of contact and would have become shallower as the blade traveled. But Graham's wound was consistent, the same depth throughout its length. Graham's wounds, Dr. Kennard concluded, were self-inflicted. And then there was Colin Bedell Taylor's body. He'd been found clutching the Stanley knife in his right hand. But when forensic investigators examined him closely, they made a crucial discovery. Colin's entire right palm was covered with his own blood. Not splattered blood. Not blood from the knife. His own blood from the gunshot wounds. If Colin had been holding the knife when he was shot, there would have been a void, a clean space on his palm where the knife handle had been. But there was no void. The blood covered every inch of his hand. That meant Colin Bedell Taylor had not been holding the knife when he was shot. Someone had placed it in his hand afterward. The Stanley knife itself was another piece of evidence. It had initials carved into the handle, but they weren't Colin's initials. And when police searched Colin's workshop, they found he owned roughly 500 tools. Not one of them was marked with his initials. Colin Bedell Taylor was a craftsman, proud of his work, but he wasn't in the habit of inscribing his tools. The knife, the police realized, had been placed there to frame a dead man. The investigation shifted. Police obtained a warrant to search Whitten Hill Farm more thoroughly, and in a drawer in Graham Backhouse's house, they found a notebook. Inside that notebook was a doodle, just an idle drawing. The kind of thing someone might sketch while talking on the phone or thinking through a problem. But this doodle was important, very important, because when document examiner Mike Hall had examined the threatening note that had been attached to the sheep's head, the note that read, "You next," he'd noticed something. On the back of the paper there was a faint impression. Someone had written on a sheet of paper that had been sitting on top of the threat note, and the pressure of the pen had left an indentation. That indentation formed a doodle, and now, here in Graham Backhouse's drawer, was the matching doodle, identical. The same loops, the same lines. There was more. A fiber found clinging to the threatening letter was analyzed and matched to one of Graham's own sweaters. The handwriting on the threatening letters was examined. The misspellings, the crude grammar, it had all been deliberate, an attempt to disguise the writer's true hand. But handwriting analysis revealed the truth. Graham Backhouse had written those letters. All of them. And then there was the matter of the life insurance. Police discovered that Graham hadn't just been in debt. He'd been drowning in it. £70,000. With no way out. But Margaret had life insurance. Initially £50,000. It wasn't enough to solve Graham's problems. So in March of 1984, just weeks before the car bombing, Graham had increased Margaret's life insurance policy. He doubled it. £100,000 if she died. Enough to pay off his debts. Enough to save the farm. Enough to start over. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Graham Backhouse had tried to murder his wife for the insurance money. He'd built the bomb himself, carefully wired it to the car's ignition, and set it beneath the driver's seat. He'd written the threatening letters and staged the harassment campaign to create the appearance that he was being targeted. The sheep's head on the fence, the menacing notes, all of it designed to make himself look like a victim. But Margaret had survived. Against all odds, she'd survived. And that left Graham in a terrible position. The police were investigating. They were looking for whoever had planted the bomb. Eventually they might look at him. He needed to shift suspicion elsewhere. Permanently. So he'd invited his neighbor Colin Bedell Taylor to the farm. Perhaps under the pretense of selling furniture. Perhaps with some other excuse. And once Colin was there, Graham had shot him. Twice. Point-blank range. Murdered him in cold blood. Then Graham had taken the Stanley knife. A knife he'd acquired somewhere. Marked with false initials to implicate Colin. And he'd slashed himself across the face and chest. Deep, painful wounds, but carefully placed to avoid vital areas. He'd bled all over the kitchen, then overturned furniture to suggest a struggle. He'd placed the knife in Colin's dead hand, creating a scene that would appear to be self-defense. And then he'd pressed the panic button and waited for the police to arrive, playing the role of the frightened victim one more time. But Graham Backhouse had underestimated the science of blood spatter. He'd underestimated the careful eyes of forensic examiners. And he'd underestimated the detectives who refused to accept the obvious answer when the evidence whispered a different truth. On the 13th of May, 1984, Graham Backhouse was arrested. He was charged with 1 count of attempted murder of his wife, Margaret Backhouse, and 1 count of murder of his neighbor, Colin Bedell Taylor. The trial began in early 1985 at Bristol Crown Court. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the forensic evidence, the blood spatter analysis, the self-inflicted wounds, the doodle that matched Graham's notebook, the fiber from his sweater, They showed how the threatening letters all came from Graham's own hand. They detailed his crushing debts and the conveniently increased life insurance policy. They showed that Graham had even planted evidence at Colin's home. Pieces of pipe similar to those used in the car bomb, placed there to frame his neighbor posthumously. The defense tried to argue that Graham was innocent, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the police had rushed to judgment, but the case against him was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for nearly 6 hours, and on the 19th of February, 1985, they returned their verdict. Guilty on both counts. The judge, in sentencing Graham Backhouse to 2 life sentences, spoke with barely contained anger. "You are a devious and wicked man," he said. "The enormity of the crime that you have committed is very grave." Graham Backhouse was led away to begin his sentence. In prison, he tried one last manipulation. He wrote another letter to a local newspaper, attempting to further implicate Colin Bedale Taylor in the car bombing. But prison officials intercepted the letter. Handwriting analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. Graham had written it. Even behind bars, he couldn't stop trying to shift the blame. Margaret Backhouse eventually recovered from her physical injuries, though the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain with her for the rest of her life. She divorced Graham and tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal existence. Friends and neighbors rallied around her, but the trauma of what her husband had tried to do never fully left her. In March of 1995, at the age of 48, Margaret Backhouse died peacefully in her sleep. What she thought about in those final moments, whether she found peace or whether the memory still haunted her, no one can say. Colin Bedale Taylor's death left the village of Horton shaken. He'd been a good man by all accounts, a craftsman, a neighbor who'd helped many people over the years. One villager said of him, "Colin was a good friend to a lot of people and had done many kindnesses. He will be tremendously missed by the whole village." Another said, "We don't want to remember him as a murdered man, but as someone who has done a lot of work in the village for years. He deserved better than to be murdered and framed by a desperate, selfish man." Graham Backhouse served nearly 10 years in prison. He kept active behind bars, often playing cricket with other inmates. It was during one of these cricket matches, on a day in June of 1994, that Graham Backhouse suffered a fatal heart attack. He collapsed on the field and died. He was 53 years old. Strangely, after his death, it came to light that Graham had been engaged to be married. His fiancée was a woman named Rosemary Aberdor, a con artist who'd served 2 years in prison herself for stealing nearly £3 million from the National Hospital for Neurology Development Foundation, while posing as a titled aristocrat. Even in prison, Graham Backhouse had been drawn to deception. The case of Graham Backhouse remains a stark reminder of how far desperation can drive a person. Here was a man who, faced with financial ruin, decided that the life of his devoted wife was worth less than £100,000. When that plan failed, he murdered an innocent neighbor to cover his tracks, framing a grieving father and widow for crimes he himself had committed. But the case also stands as a testament to the power of forensic science and careful investigation. The round blood drops on the kitchen floor, the void that should have been on Colin's palm, the faint impression of a doodle on the back of a threatening note. These small details, easily overlooked, told the truth when lies might have prevailed. In the village of Horton, life went on. The fields turned green each spring, the sheep grazed on the hillsides, and the farms endured as they had for generations. But the people there never forgot what had happened at Whitten Hill Farm. They never forgot Margaret, who survived the unsurvivable. They never forgot Colin, murdered for the crime of being in the wrong place when a desperate man needed a scapegoat. And perhaps in the quiet moments of an English evening, when the sun sets over the Cotswolds and the shadows grow long, they remember Graham Backhouse too. Not with sympathy, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that darkness can flourish even in the most beautiful places, and that the person who claims to be the victim may sometimes be the perpetrator. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we journey to the military town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where love, betrayal, and ambition converged in a story that would shake the foundations of two families forever. This is the story of Captain Marty Thier, a gentle soul whose life was cut short on a cold December night in the year 2000. In the late 1980s, in the sprawling landscape of Denver, Colorado, two young people met in high school. Their names were Frank Martin Thier, who went by Marty, and Michelle Catherine Forcier. Both came from military families, children raised on bases around the world, moving from place to place as their parents served their country. This shared experience created an instant bond between them. Marty was born in Würzburg, Germany, in February of 1969, the son of Linda Gettler. He grew up as a quiet, gentle boy who loved playing ball and board games. With the neighborhood children, those who knew him described him as tender-hearted, someone without a mean bone in his body, someone who wouldn't say a bad word about anyone. He was the kind of person who made friends easily, though he wore a reserved, thoughtful demeanor. Michelle was born in December of 1970 in Denver, the eldest of three siblings. Her childhood was marked by responsibility beyond her years. When her parents' marriage dissolved after her father was stationed in South Korea without the family, Michelle's mother returned to work full-time. The care of her younger siblings, Angela and Tom, fell largely on Michelle's shoulders. She spent her weekends at the local Baptist church, immersed in Bible study, with little time for the carefree activities of adolescence. When Marty and Michelle met in high school, it seemed like destiny. Friends and family members looked at them and saw perfection. She was outgoing and extroverted, a perfect balance to his quiet reserve. They shared the unique bond of military children, understanding the transient lifestyle, the frequent goodbyes, the challenge of making home wherever the Air Force sent them. After graduation, their paths diverged temporarily. Marty pursued his dream of becoming a pilot, enrolling in the United States Air Force Academy. Michelle joined the Air Force Reserves and began her own journey. For 4 long years, they maintained a long-distance relationship, connected by letters, phone calls, and the occasional visit when circumstances allowed. Then came 1991. Michelle's reserve company was activated for service in the Persian Gulf War. The prospect of deployment, the uncertainty of war, and the years of separation suddenly crystallized something in Marty's heart. He realized they had been apart long enough. Before she deployed, he proposed to his high school sweetheart, and Michelle said yes. They married that same year, shortly after Marty graduated from the Air Force Academy. Michelle was 20 years old, Marty was 22, and they believed their future stretched endlessly before them, filled with adventure and shared dreams. Marriage in the military is never simple. For the next 9 years, Marty and Michelle bounced from base to base, state to state, Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida. Each new posting meant packing up their lives, saying goodbye to new friends, starting over in another unfamiliar town. It was the life they had known as children, and now it defined their marriage. Marty rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a captain. He flew C-130 cargo planes, massive aircraft that required skill, concentration, and long hours away from home. His deployments took him overseas for weeks at a time, leaving Michelle alone to manage their household and pursue her own ambitions. Michelle had always been driven. While they moved from base to base, she worked toward her psychology degree, studying to become a licensed psychotherapist. She had dreams of building a career helping others, perhaps inspired by her own childhood struggles with responsibility and her parents' divorce. As long as she was busy with her studies, she could manage the loneliness of military life. In 1999, the Thuries arrived at their latest posting, Pope Air Force Base, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Pope was part of the sprawling Fort Bragg military installation, home to Army Special Forces and airborne divisions. Fayetteville was a military town through and through, a place where soldiers and their families tried to build normal lives amid the constant rhythm of deployments and returns. Marty settled into his duties as a C-130 pilot. Michelle found work with a psychologist named Thomas Harbin, sharing office space in a building on Rayford Road while she worked toward obtaining her permanent license as a clinical psychologist. She was close to achieving her goal, close to having the career she had worked so hard to build. But something was shifting beneath the surface of their marriage. With her degree complete and her days now spent working rather than studying, Michelle found herself confronting the empty hours when Marty was deployed. The loneliness felt different now, heavier somehow. She and Marty had always bickered when he was home. They were two strong personalities trying to share space after weeks or months apart. She complained that he preferred staying in when she wanted to go out. He complained about her housekeeping. She found him obsessive compulsive. He found her distant. In the year 2000, they began marriage counseling, both recognizing that something fundamental was fracturing between them. They attended sessions in Florida, trying to work through their issues, trying to find the connection they had shared as high school sweethearts. But the sessions revealed how far they had drifted. The problems ran deeper than either wanted to admit. And then there was the internet. In the late 1990s, the internet was still relatively new, a frontier of connection and anonymity. For lonely people, it offered something intoxicating, the ability to be someone else, to find connection without the complications of real life. Michelle began spending time in online chat rooms. They started innocently enough, perhaps just a way to pass the empty hours. But gradually she found herself drawn to the adult chat rooms, places where people flirted and sought romantic connections. It was an escape from the disappointments of her marriage, a place where she could feel desired and interesting again. In one of these Yahoo chat rooms in 1998, Michelle met a man who called himself John Diamond. John McKeel Diamond was an Army staff sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg, the same military installation where Marty worked. He was 28 years old, handsome and charming in the way that certain men can be, like the Thuras. John came from a military family. His grandfather had been a prisoner of war in World War II. His father was a Vietnam veteran. John had graduated high school and enlisted in the Army in 1991, the same year Marty and Michelle married. By 1998, John was on his second marriage, and it was already showing cracks. He had a history of infidelity, of seeking excitement outside the boundaries of commitment. When he connected with Michelle in that chat room, something sparked between them immediately. They spent months exchanging messages. Flirtation led to deeper conversations, sharing the frustrations of their respective marriages, understanding each other's military backgrounds. Michelle found him charming, exciting, a relief from the tension of her life with Marty. John later said it was love at first sight. Eventually they agreed to meet in person at a coffee shop in Fayetteville. The chemistry they had felt online translated seamlessly to reality. They began an affair. For Michelle, John represented everything that was missing in her marriage. Attention, excitement, someone who made her feel alive. For John, Michelle became an obsession, even as his own marriage collapsed under the weight of his infidelities. His focus turned entirely toward the psychologist who seemed to understand him. In the summer of 2000, Michelle made a decision. She moved out of the home she shared with Marty and rented an apartment off base. For 3 months, she and John lived together, playing at the life they imagined they could have. It should have been perfect. But relationships born from affairs rarely are. The excitement that comes from forbidden meetings loses its luster when confronted with everyday reality. The same problems that plagued Michelle's marriage with Marty began to surface with John. Living together revealed incompatibilities they hadn't noticed in the glow of their affair. Still, they tried. In October of 2000, Michelle and John took a vacation to the Netherlands Antilles in the Caribbean. Michelle even applied for a position at Sabi University School of Medicine, listing John on the application as her fiancé. They met with school administrators, including a man named William Cornell, the chief administrator, who casually mentioned his former position as a prosecutor in the United States. Something about that conversation unsettled them. Michelle and John abruptly fled the island without further contact with the university. They never explained why, but one can imagine the sudden fear that their plans, whatever they were, might be exposed. Back in Fayetteville, the relationship began to unravel. Michelle broke things off with John via a brusque email, the kind of cold ending that leaves wounds. But Marty, ever hopeful, convinced Michelle to return home. He believed they could save their marriage. They were attending counseling, after all. They were trying. Michelle moved back in with her husband in the fall of 2000. On the surface, they were working on their relationship. But Michelle and John's relationship didn't truly end. It transformed into an on-again, off-again affair. A messy tangle of emotions that neither seemed able to untangle. John sent Michelle constant emails and instant messages. Digital evidence would later reveal hundreds upon hundreds of these messages. Declarations of love, questions about why she stayed with a man she claimed made her miserable, pleas for her to choose him instead. The messages evolved from romantic to desperate, from loving to obsessive. Meanwhile, Michelle continued to seek connections with other men online. Investigators would later discover that she had posted personal ads seeking encounters, maintaining a secret life that even John didn't fully know about. She met at least one other man, a person named Charles McClendon, with whom she had a brief affair in late 1999 to early 2000. But it was John Diamond who remained central to her life. John Diamond who couldn't let go. John Diamond who would do anything to keep her. The Christmas season of 2000 arrived with its usual decorations and celebrations. On December 17th, a Sunday evening, Marty and Michelle attended a holiday dinner party. They traveled from Fayetteville to Cary, North Carolina. About an hour's drive, joining Dr. Thomas Harbin, Michelle's colleague who shared office space with her, along with his wife and another couple. The dinner was pleasant enough. They celebrated the season, shared conversation, enjoyed the food, but Marty needed to wake early the next morning for flight duties. So as the evening progressed, they prepared to leave. Around 10:30 at night, they departed the restaurant with the Harbins and the other couple in tow. Driving back toward Fayetteville, Michelle and Marty planned to drop off their companions at the office building on Radford Road, where Michelle and Dr. Harbin worked. It was a simple detour on their way home, a matter of convenience. But as they neared the office building, Michelle suddenly remembered something. She had left important documents on her desk, papers she needed for work. Could they please stop? It would only take a moment. Marty agreed. Of course he did. It was a small request, and he was that kind of person, someone who helped without complaint. He pulled into the parking lot of the office building at 2500 Rayford Road. Michelle got out of the car and headed up the back stairs to her second-floor office. The building was quiet at that hour, dark except for the occasional security light. Marty waited in the car while Dr. Harbin and his wife stood nearby, chatting, ready to get their own vehicle and head home. Minutes passed. Michelle had been gone longer than expected. Marty grew concerned. He turned off the car and stepped out into the December night, deciding to check on his wife. He walked to the back of the building and began climbing the stairs to the second floor. That's when the gunshots shattered the silence. 5 shots in rapid succession. The sound echoed across the parking lot, unmistakable and terrifying. Dr. Harbin and his wife froze, trying to process what they had heard. Then Michelle appeared at the top of the stairs. Screaming, she ran down toward her office, but found the door locked. She had left her keys on her desk. Panicked, she fled across the street to a video rental store that was still open, a place called Video Hut. She burst through the door, frantic, her sweater and hands stained with blood. 2 employees, Condra Fusey and Joyce Smith, looked up in shock as this young woman began screaming that her husband had been shot, that someone had murdered him. The employees noticed something odd, though. Michelle seemed upset, yes, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. Her pulse, when checked later, was completely normal. It seemed strange for someone who had just witnessed her husband being killed, that there was no time to puzzle over these details. The employees called 911. Michelle ran back across the street to be with Marty. By the time police and emergency responders arrived minutes later, they found Michelle kneeling in the parking lot, cradling Marty's head in her arms, her clothes covered in his blood. She was telling him everything would be all right, that help was here. But help had come too late. Captain Frank Martin Fair, 31 years old, lay dead on the stairs. He had been shot 5 times. 4 bullets had struck him as he climbed the stairs. Then, as he lay dying on the ground, someone had walked up and fired a final shot at close range behind his left ear. It was execution style, deliberate and brutal. The cause of death was massive blood loss from the 5 gunshot wounds. Sergeant Ralph Klinskills of the Fayetteville Police Department interviewed Michelle at the scene. Her story was straightforward. She and Marty had attended a Christmas party, stopped at her office so she could retrieve important documents, gone inside and heard gunshots, panicked when she found her door locked with her keys inside, run to the video store for help, but certain details bothered investigators immediately. Marty's wallet was still in his pocket. His car keys were with him. The car sat untouched in the parking lot. This wasn't a robbery. Someone had waited for Marty Thier specifically. hidden in the darkness by those stairs, and executed him. Why? The police began digging into Marty's life. He had no enemies that anyone knew of. He was well liked at Pope Air Force Base, a competent pilot and a gentle person. There were no disputes, no debts, no obvious reasons for someone to want him dead. Then investigators looked at Michelle's life and a different picture emerged. They discovered the affair with John Diamond. They learned about Michelle's online activities, the chat rooms, the personal ads. They uncovered the separation earlier that year, the attempt at reconciliation, the ongoing contact between Michelle and John even after she returned to Marty. They found John Diamond's emails to Michelle. Hundreds of messages that grew increasingly desperate and obsessive over time. In one message, John wrote that he couldn't wait until they could take care of each other, mentioning intimacy explicitly. In another, he declared they were kindred soulmates, that he would always love her no matter how she had hurt him. The progression was clear, from a sexual relationship to complete emotional fixation. John Diamond was willing to do anything for Michelle. Investigators also discovered a financial motive. Marty had recently re-enlisted in the Air Force, receiving a substantial bonus payment. More significantly, he had taken out a life insurance policy through the Servicemen's Group life insurance program worth $500,000. Michelle was listed as the sole beneficiary. The timeline was damning. Michelle had filed a claim for that insurance money within days of Marty's death. While building their case, investigators learned something crucial from John Diamond's friends and acquaintances. Just days before the murder, John had borrowed a handgun from a friend. It was a Smith & Wesson Model 5906, a semi-automatic pistol. John told his friend he needed it for protection. Ballistics analysis of the bullets recovered from Marty's body in the crime scene matched the type of ammunition used by that model of weapon. Then in February of 2001, just 2 months after the murder, John Diamond reported that his car had been broken into and the borrowed gun had been stolen. He filed a police report, creating a paper trail to explain why he no longer had the weapon. But investigators saw through this transparent attempt to distance himself from the murder weapon. The timing was too convenient. The gun disappeared exactly when John would need it to disappear. On March 15, 2001, Army officials charged John Diamond with premeditated murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Because he was an active duty soldier, he would face a military court-martial rather than a civilian trial. The Army had no jurisdiction over Michelle, a civilian, but they strongly encouraged Fayetteville police to build a case against her as well. John Diamond's court-martial began in August of 2001 at Fort Bragg. The case presented by military prosecutors was circumstantial but compelling. They established John's obsessive relationship with Michelle. They presented the borrowed gun. They showed his suspicious report of its theft. They demonstrated that he had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit the murder. The prosecution's theory was clear. John Diamond, deeply in love with Michelle and desperate to be with her, had ambushed Marty Theart and executed him so that Michelle would be free to be with him. Michelle was called to testify. She took the stand, but on the advice of her attorney, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination with every single question. She refused to answer anything. Her silence spoke volumes to the military jury. The defense tried to argue that Michelle had manipulated John, that she was the true mastermind who had used John's infatuation to convince him to commit murder. They suggested John was a victim of manipulation, acting on Michelle's behalf. On August 28, 2001, the 6-member military panel found John Diamond guilty on all counts: premeditated murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But Michelle remained free. As civilian authorities built their case against Michelle, they seized her computers and began forensic analysis. What they discovered was extraordinary in its scope and its implication. 88,000 emails and instant messages. Personal ads Michelle had posted in 1999 seeking sexual encounters. The webmail correspondence responding to those ads. Clear documentation of her relationship with John Diamond. Evidence of her affair with Charles McClendon, and most disturbingly, messages that appeared to document discussions about the conspiracy to murder Marty. One piece of evidence particularly chilled investigators: records showing that Michelle had searched eBay for body bags shortly before Marty's murder. The digital footprint revealed a woman living multiple secret lives, seeking connections and excitement outside her marriage. while maintaining the appearance of a psychologist working toward reconciliation with her husband. The evidence also showed the push-pull dynamic between Michelle and John in the months leading up to the murder. She would push him away, then pull him back. She kept him emotionally off balance, desperate for her attention, willing to do anything to keep her. Prosecutors began to believe that Michelle had deliberately manipulated John Diamond into killing Marty. She had complained to John about her husband, perhaps exaggerating or inventing stories of abuse. She had suggested, directly or indirectly, that her life would be better if Marty were gone. She had used John's obsessive love for her as a weapon, pointing him at her husband like a gun. On May 16, 2002, a grand jury in Fayetteville indicted Michelle Thull on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, arguing the murder was committed for financial gain. But when authorities went to serve the indictment, Michelle was gone. She had been living in New Orleans since shortly after Marty's death, trying to build a new life away from Fayetteville and its memories. But 5 days before the grand jury indicted her, Michelle vanished. She had somehow learned what was coming and fled. For 3 months, U.S. Marshals searched for her. They tracked leads across state lines, piecing together her movements through careful detective work. Michelle had studied how to disappear, how to avoid creating a paper trail, how to obtain false identification. Then in August of 2002, U.S. Marshals received a tip that led them to a small cottage in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They knocked on the door and a woman answered. She looked like Michelle Furrier, but different. Her red hair had been bleached blonde and cut short. Her face appeared puffier, blotchier, changed in ways that couldn't be explained by time alone. She had marker lines on her face, the kind plastic surgeons draw before procedures. Deputy U.S. Marshal David Kingsbury noticed what appeared to be recent laser treatment burns on her skin. The woman denied she had undergone plastic surgery, claiming instead that she had been in an accident. But in her apartment, marshals found books about creating fake identification and avoiding paper trails. They found evidence of her plans to completely reinvent herself and vanish permanently. She had slipped up once, Marshal Kingsbury later said. A single mistake in her careful plans to disappear. One document or transaction that left a trail, and they had found her. Michelle Thull was arrested and extradited back to North Carolina to face trial for the murder of her husband. Michelle's trial began in September of 2004, nearly 4 years after Marty's death. The Cumberland County Courthouse in Fayetteville became the stage for one of the most sensational trials in the region's history. Superior Court Judge Jim Ammons imposed a gag order on prosecutors and defense attorneys, hoping to prevent the case from being tried in the media, but it was too late. The story of the psychologist who allegedly manipulated her lover into murdering her husband, then fled and underwent plastic surgery to avoid capture, had captured national attention. The prosecution presented a methodical case. They showed the jury the timeline of Michelle's affair with John Diamond. They introduced evidence of her other affairs, arguing it demonstrated her pattern of behavior and her willingness to deceive. They presented the 88,000 emails and messages, letting Michelle's own words reveal her state of mind and her disengagement from her marriage. They established the financial motive, the $500,000 life insurance policy and Marty's re-enlistment bonus. They showed that Michelle had separated from Marty in the summer, moved in with John, then returned to Marty in the fall, right around the time Marty signed up for these financial benefits. The prosecution argued that Michelle had gone back to Marty, not out of love or a desire to save their marriage, but to ensure she would receive the money when he died. She had manipulated both men, Marty into thinking she wanted reconciliation, and John into believing that killing Marty would free her to be with him. The defense team, led by attorneys Kirk Osborne and Matt Cockman, argued that the prosecution's case was purely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking Michelle to the murder. There were no eyewitnesses. No one had heard Michelle explicitly ask John to kill Marty. The evidence showed she had affairs. Yes, but affairs weren't murder. They questioned why Michelle should face the death penalty when John Diamond, the actual shooter, had not. They suggested the real story was that John Diamond had acted on his own obsessive impulses, perhaps misinterpreting things Michelle had said, perhaps creating a fantasy in his mind that she wanted Marty dead. Regarding Michelle's flight and her attempts to alter her appearance, The defense promised they had an explanation that wasn't what the prosecution portrayed, though they were vague about details. The trial lasted through September and into early December. Witnesses testified about the fears troubled marriage, Michelle's affairs, John's obsession. Experts analyzed the digital evidence. Marty's mother, Linda Gettler, spoke about her son's gentle nature and her devastating loss. On December 3rd, 2004, just 6 days before Michelle's 34th birthday, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty on both counts. First-degree murder by aiding and abetting, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Superior Court judge sentenced Michelle Ferrer to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, plus an additional 13 years for conspiracy. Linda Gettler, Marty's mother, expressed relief that justice had finally been served for her son. Michelle Ferrer was transported to the North Carolina Correctional Institute for Women in Raleigh to begin serving her sentence. John Diamond remained in a federal prison, serving his own life sentence.
Both maintained their innocence.
With the help of her mother and sister, Michelle created a blog where she proclaimed she had been wrongfully convicted, that she was a victim of circumstantial evidence and media sensationalism. The blog continued until 2011 before the domain name eventually lapsed. Prison officials documented numerous infractions during Michelle's incarceration. She was written up for disobeying orders, unauthorized use of phone and mail, profane language, and other violations. But the most serious incident occurred in May of 2010. Prison officials intercepted maps that had been mailed to Michelle. The maps showed the area surrounding the prison facility in detail. The North Carolina Department of Correction charged Michelle with attempted escape, even though she had never physically left the prison grounds. Officials believed the maps indicated she was planning an escape attempt. Michelle was given 45 days in solitary confinement as punishment. Prison officials never publicly identified who sent her the maps, but that person was permanently banned from contacting or visiting Michelle. In April of 2011, a federal appeals court denied Michelle's request for a new trial, finding no merit in her appeals. Remarkably, in 2010, John Diamond filed a lawsuit against his prison, alleging that officials were censoring his letters to his wife in violation of his First Amendment rights. Yes, his wife. John Diamond had married someone while in prison, and he wanted to write her explicit letters without interference. The lawsuit sought $1 million in punitive damages. The outcome of this lawsuit is lost to the public record, but it speaks to John Diamond's continued sense of entitlement, even behind bars. Today, Michelle Ferrer is 54 years old. She remains incarcerated at the Anson Correctional Institution in Polkton, North Carolina, serving her life sentence without possibility of parole. John Diamond, now 50 years old, is imprisoned at the Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman Medium in Wildwood, Florida, also serving life without parole. Captain Frank Martin Marty. Ferrer never got to see his 32nd birthday. He never got to fulfill the potential of his Air Force career. He never got to find the happiness that had eluded him in his marriage. His mother, Linda Gettler, continues to remember him as the gentle, kind young man who wouldn't say a bad word about anyone. The case of Marty Ferrer's murder has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and television programs. It remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, manipulation, and the dark places that unhappy relationships can lead when greed and desperation take control. In the end, this story is about three people whose lives became fatally entangled. A husband trying to save his marriage, a wife seeking escape from loneliness and disappointment, a lover willing to do anything for the woman he believed he loved. It's about the choices we make in moments of weakness, and how those choices can echo through time, destroying lives and families. It's about the digital trails we leave behind, the evidence of our secret selves preserved in emails and messages we never imagined anyone else would read. Most of all, it's about a gentle man named Marty Ferrer, who climbed a set of stairs on a December night, trusting his wife, trying to be helpful, never knowing that someone waited in the darkness for him. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we journey into a story that unfolded in the quiet snow-covered streets of Pittsford, New York. A story of secrets hidden behind closed doors, of a family fractured by years of pain, and of a single devastating decision made on a cold February night in 2015. This is the story of Ling Tan, known to most as Jim, a successful businessman, a father, a husband, and on February 9th, 2015, a murder victim. But like all true crime stories worth telling, this one isn't simple. It's layered with complexity, painted in shades of gray rather than black and white. Pittsford, New York sits just outside Rochester, a suburb where success quietly announces itself through well-maintained homes and manicured lawns. It's the kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways, where achievement is expected, and where secrets, when they exist, stay firmly behind closed doors. The Tan family seemed to embody the American dream. Jim Tan, 49 years old, had built something remarkable. Originally from China, he and his wife Jane had immigrated first to Canada, where their 2 sons were born. Before settling in upstate New York, Jim founded Dynamax Imaging, a digital optics company that created sensors for cameras and smartphones. The business thrived, and the family lived comfortably in a beautiful home on Coachside Lane, a street name that evoked images of horse-drawn carriages and genteel living. Their younger son Charlie seemed destined for greatness. Class president, star athlete, accepted to Cornell University, one of the Ivy League's most prestigious institutions. At 19 years old, he was studying agriculture and life sciences, building toward a future that seemed limitless. To the outside world, the Tan family had everything, but inside their home on Coachside Lane, a different story was being written, one that would remain hidden until a single gunshot shattered the silence on a winter night. The first cracks in the facade appeared long before that February evening. Between 2003 and 2015, Monroe County Sheriff's deputies were called to the Tan residence 18 times. 18 calls for help, spread across 12 years. Most of these visits remained quietly documented in police files. Neighbors occasionally noticed the flashing lights of patrol cars in the driveway, but in a community like Pittsford, people respected privacy. They minded their own business. They assumed everything would work itself out. Tracy Berry, who lived nearby, later admitted to reporters that the police presence wasn't surprising. She'd seen it before, she said. But what happened in February 2015? That shocked her to her core. On January 28, 2015, just days before the murder, Jin Tan made another 911 call. Her voice on the recording trembles with fear, the words tumbling out between gasps. "My name is Jean Tan, and my husband just beats me up. I need your protection." The dispatcher's voice remains calm, professional. "Are you injured?" "Yes. He choked me, and I'm so scared." When deputies arrived, they found Jean with visible injuries. But when they asked if she wanted her husband arrested, she refused. This pattern had repeated itself for years. Calls for help, followed by reluctance to press charges. An order of protection started but never completed. A consultation with a divorce lawyer that led nowhere. Jim Tan, when confronted, dismissed his wife's claims. Childish, he called them. Nothing serious. Just a misunderstanding. The deputies left that night, as they had left so many times before, handing Jean a business card with information about domestic violence resources. And life in the Tan household continued, at least on the surface. But something was different this time, because this time Jean didn't just call the police. She also called her son. Charlie Tan had left for Cornell University seeking normalcy, achievement, a life beyond the chaos of his childhood home. His friends at school knew him as kind, gentle, someone who kept his emotions carefully controlled. Anna Valentine, one of his closest friends, later told reporters she had no idea what Charlie's home life was like. He never talked about it. He was very good at hiding pain, but distance didn't provide escape. Even at Cornell, Charlie couldn't outrun the situation at home. He called his mother regularly, checking in, making sure she was safe. And when Jean told him what happened on January 28th, when she described waking up with bruises around her neck, when she said she'd been choked until she lost consciousness, Charlie listened with growing dread. If something bad happens to me, Jean had warned her sons back in December, 2 months earlier. It's your dad. And now, in early February, that warning seemed prophetic. On February 4th, Jean called Charlie again. Another incident. Another attack. But this time, her voice carried a finality that terrified her son. Next time, she told him, I won't survive. Charlie made a decision that night. A decision that would destroy his future and shatter multiple lives. A decision that once made could never be undone. February 5th, 2015. Dawn cold and gray. Snow blanketed the Cornell campus in Ithaca, New York. About an hour's drive from Pittsford, Charlie Tan woke that morning with a plan forming in his mind. He'd tried to buy a gun himself the day dare, at a Walmart in Ithaca, but his Canadian citizenship had complicated the purchase. The application was delayed, pending additional verification. He couldn't wait. Charlie approached Whitney Knickerbocker, a Cornell freshman who'd pledged Charlie's fraternity Chi Phi. Charlie offered Knickerbocker $800 and spun a story about needing a gun for a hunting trip. Knickerbocker agreed. They returned to Walmart together. Knickerbocker selected a 12-gauge Remington shotgun and 2 boxes of ammunition. He signed the paperwork affirming he was the ultimate purchaser. Then he handed everything to Charlie. What happened next remains somewhat unclear, lost in the haze of memory and conflicting testimonies. But what we know is this. Charlie emptied his bank account. He told friends he might be leaving the country, and late that afternoon he drove from Cornell back to Pittsford, back to the house on Coachside Lane, back to the home where his mother waited in fear. The drive takes about an hour in good weather. Charlie would have had time to think, time to reconsider, but he didn't turn back. The house was quiet when Charlie arrived. Snowdrifts lined the driveway. Inside, Jim Tan sat at his desk in the second-floor study, working late as he often did. Years later, in a sworn affidavit filed in federal court, Charlie would describe what happened next in stark, simple terms. I entered my parents' home through the back door, walked upstairs, turned into my father's office, and shot my father 3 times as he was sitting at his desk. The first shot struck Jim in the chest. The second hit his arm. The third, fired at close range, tore through his face. I knew I had killed him, Charlie wrote. The sound of the gunshots shattered the winter silence. Smoke drifted in the cold air of the study. Jim Tan slumped forward at his desk. His face unrecognizable, his life ended in seconds. Charlie stood there, the shotgun in his hands, and in that moment he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. I knew that in killing my father, I would be throwing away my future, he later wrote. But I wasn't thinking of that after the February 4th call. I did not think past getting a gun, shooting my father, taking my mother to Canada, and fleeing to China. He'd acted, he said, to protect his mother. He'd seen no other way. But now, standing in his father's office with the body growing cold before him, the reality crashed down. 4 days passed before anyone reported the murder. 4 days of silence, of cleanup, of desperate planning. On February 9th, at approximately 6:10 in the evening, Jean Tan called 911. The dispatcher answered to the sound of a woman crying, her words nearly incomprehensible through her distress. My name is Jean Tan, she managed to say. I heard an argument. My son was talking to my husband. Ma'am, what's going on? I heard a shot. Does somebody in the house have a gun? Yes. Does somebody need an ambulance? A pause. Then he's dead. My husband is dead. When Monroe County Sheriff's deputies arrived at 37 Coachside Lane, they found Charlie and Jean standing in the driveway, waiting. The flashing red and blue lights painted the snow in garish colors. Deputy Christopher Cooper approached Charlie. The young man looked calm, almost eerily so. When asked where his father was, Charlie replied simply, "He's upstairs," and then before Cooper could say anything else, Charlie spoke again. The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if reciting something he'd rehearsed. He's dead. I had to do it. He was going to kill my mom. Inside the house, deputies found Jim Tan's body exactly where Charlie had left it seated at his desk in the second-floor study. The scene was gruesome. Jim's face was destroyed, nearly unrecognizable. Blood had pooled and dried. The metallic smell of death hung heavy in the cold air. In the garage, deputies discovered the shotgun. Charlie was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, a Class A1 felony. If convicted, he faced 25 years to life in prison. As news of the arrest spread through Pittsford and Cornell, Charlie's friends struggled to reconcile the gentle young man they knew with the crime he'd admitted to committing. Anna Valentine and Josh Idem, two of Charlie's closest friends from high school, were devastated. "I had no idea about his family situation," Anna told reporters. "He kept it all to himself. He was very good at hiding it." Within days, Anna created an online fundraising page to help with Charlie's legal defense. Hundreds of people donated, expressing support for someone they described as kind, caring, someone who must have been desperate to take such drastic action. But public opinion was divided. Some saw Charlie as a murderer who'd callously executed his father. Others viewed him as a victim himself, a young man pushed to an unbearable breaking point by years of witnessing his mother's abuse. Charlie's defense attorneys, James Nobles and Brian DeCarolis, built their case around domestic violence. They painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning years, of a household ruled by fear, of a mother who'd been beaten and choked and terrorized. The 911 call from January 28th became crucial evidence. Jurors heard Gene's terrified voice. "He choked me, and I'm so scared." Neighbors testified the police had been called to the house repeatedly. Deputies confirmed they'd left Gene with domestic violence resources. Former employees of Dynamax Imaging took the stand, describing Jim as a bully, someone who berated workers, who behaved childishly when things didn't go his way, who made the workplace miserable. It was almost as if we were put in the hell that Charlie lived in for a brief moment. Nobles later reflected on the hell that Gene lived in for a brief moment. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Sandra Dorley and Prosecutor William Gargan, argued something different. They acknowledged the abuse. They didn't deny it, but they maintained that domestic violence, however severe, didn't justify murder. "This case is about Charlie's deliberate decision to kill his father," Gargan told the jury, and the prosecution had evidence of deliberation. Charlie had tried to buy a gun himself, failed, then recruited someone else to purchase it for him. He'd emptied his bank account. He'd told friends he might flee the country. These weren't the actions of someone acting in the heat of passion, they argued. These were the actions of someone planning murder. The trial began in September 2015, 8 months after the killing. For 9 days, testimony unfolded in Monroe County Court before Judge James Piampiano. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness statements, a timeline of events. They showed the jury graphic photographs of Jim's body, his face destroyed by shotgun blasts. Some jurors looked away. Others stared, trying to process the violence. But the prosecution faced challenges. They had no eyewitnesses who could place Charlie at the scene at the moment of the murder. The only forensic evidence linking Charlie to the gun was his fingerprints on the ammunition. But as the defense pointed out, he could have touched those shells before the shooting, after the shooting, at any time. The gun itself bore no trace of Charlie's DNA. The defense maintained that Charlie hadn't pulled the trigger at all. They suggested carefully and without stating it outright that perhaps Joan had been the shooter. Perhaps she'd finally had enough. Perhaps she'd acted in self-defense, and Charlie was covering for her. The timeline was murky. The prosecution believed Jim died on February 5th, but they couldn't prove it conclusively. Computer activity suggested someone had used Jim's devices between February 5th and 9th, complicating the narrative. And then there was Charlie's confession to Deputy Cooper. "I had to do it. He was going to kill my mom." But was this a genuine confession, or had Charlie been protecting his mother from the moment deputies arrived? After 9 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. 10 women and 2 men deliberated for 8 days, requesting testimony to be read back, examining evidence repeatedly. The jury was deadlocked. Some believed Charlie was guilty of murder. Others felt the domestic violence created reasonable doubt. Still others wondered if Gene, not Charlie, had pulled the trigger. On October 8th, 2015, Judge Piampiano declared a mistrial. A mistrial isn't an acquittal. The prosecution could try Charlie again, and initially that's exactly what they planned to do. But then, in a move that shocked courtroom observers, prosecutors and the Tan family, Judge Piampiano made a dramatic decision. In November 2015, he dismissed all charges against Charlie Tan. The prosecution had failed. The judge ruled to present sufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Charlie had committed murder. The forensic evidence was too weak, the timeline too uncertain, the confession too ambiguous. Charlie walked free. The prosecution appealed, but in March 2017, the Supreme Court of the State of New York's Appellate Division unanimously upheld the dismissal. Charlie Tan would not face murder charges again. For many, this seemed like the end of the story. A young man had escaped a murder conviction, had preserved his future, had avoided prison. But the story wasn't over, not even close. On September 22nd, 2017, more than 2 years after the murder, Charlie Tan attempted to cross from Canada into the United States near Buffalo. He was heading to a friend's wedding. At the border, federal agents arrested him. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had been building a case. While New York State couldn't prove Charlie had murdered his father, the federal government could prove something else. That Charlie had orchestrated an illegal straw purchase of a firearm. Whitney Knickerbocker, the Cornell freshman who'd bought the shotgun, testified that Charlie had asked him to purchase it, paid him $800, and claimed he needed it for hunting. Federal law prohibits buying a gun on behalf of someone else when that person intends to use it for unlawful purposes. Charlie was charged with 3 federal felonies: receiving a firearm with intent to use it to commit a felony, causing another to make a false written statement to a federal firearms dealer, and causing another to make a false record required by law to be kept by a federal firearms dealer. On June 22, 2018, Charlie pleaded guilty to all 3 charges. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested 25 years, the maximum penalty. Charlie's attorneys pushed for 5 years, submitting dozens of letters from friends and family attesting to his character, describing the abuse in the household, arguing for mercy. On November 19, 2018, federal judge Frederick Scullin sentenced Charlie Tan to 20 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Scullin was blunt. The evidence, he said, overwhelmingly pointed to premeditated murder. Charlie had deliberately purchased the gun, deliberately returned home, deliberately killed his father. You are an extremely disturbed individual, the judge told Charlie. To this day, you refuse to explain what happened that night. The judge described the actions of Charlie and his family after the murder as a bizarre scheme to cover up the murder. Charlie's attorneys called the sentence disappointing and promised to appeal. But the sentence stood. For years, Charlie maintained a careful silence about what happened on February 5th. Even after his federal conviction, he never explicitly admitted to pulling the trigger. That changed in 2019. In November of that year, Charlie's new attorney, Joel Rudin, filed a motion seeking to vacate or reduce Charlie's sentence. The motion included a sworn affidavit from Charlie himself, and for the first time, he told the full story. I entered my parents' home through the back door, walked upstairs, turned into my father's office, and shot my father 3 times as he was sitting at his desk. I knew I had killed him. The affidavit included disturbing details about the abuse Charlie had witnessed. He described watching his father attack his mother repeatedly throughout his childhood. He detailed the phone call from Jean on January 28th, when she told him she'd been choked unconscious. If something bad happens to me, it's your dad, she'd warned back in December. And then came the final call on February 4th. Another attack. Another beating. Next time he'll kill me, Jean had said. I knew that in killing my father, I would be throwing away my future, Charlie wrote. But I wasn't thinking of that after the February 4th call. I did not think past getting a gun, shooting my father, taking my mother to Canada, and fleeing to China. I knew that killing my father was wrong, but in my own mind I felt I had to do so to protect my mother. The motion included a 51-page psychological evaluation by Dr. Sanford Drob, who concluded that Charlie had suffered a psychological breakdown at age 19, driven by years of trauma and the fear that his father would kill his mother. Charlie's attorneys argued that his previous defense team had been ineffective, that they'd failed to properly present evidence of the abuse, that they'd advised him not to testify or admit to the shooting during his weapons trial. Federal prosecutors requested 60 days to review the extensive documentation. The judge ultimately denied the motion. Charlie's sentence would not be reduced. Today, Charlie Tan is incarcerated at Raybrook Federal Prison in upstate New York, a medium security facility about 7 miles west of Lake Placid. He's serving his 20-year sentence, with a projected release date in the 2030s. His mother, Jean Tan, and his older brother, Jeffrey, took over operations of Dynamax Imaging after Jim's death. They continue to run the company, though they've largely avoided public attention. Jean has never been charged with any crime related to her husband's death. Though prosecutors once identified her as a potential accomplice, no evidence ever emerged to support charging her. The house on Coachside Lane, where Jim Tan died, remains standing. Jean continued living there alone for some time after the murder, though whether she still resides there now is unclear. The case sparked intense debate about domestic violence, self-defense, and the limits of the law. Some view Charlie as a murderer who deserved harsher punishment. Others see him as a victim who made a desperate, tragic choice to save his mother's life. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complicated middle. Charlie Tan was not a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money or revenge, but he also wasn't acting in immediate self-defense when he shot his father. He planned the killing, obtained a weapon through illegal means, and executed his father in a moment when no immediate threat existed. He acted, he said, out of love for his mother and fear for her life. Whether that justifies what he did remains a question each person must answer for themselves. The story of Ling Tan's murder reminds us that the most devastating tragedies often unfold behind closed doors, in homes that appear peaceful from the outside, in families that seem successful and intact. 18 calls to police over 12 years. 18 opportunities for intervention, and yet the abuse continued, escalating until a 19-year-old college student believed murder was his only option. What could have been different? If Jean had pressed charges? If Charlie had told someone at Cornell what was happening? If neighbors had done more than notice police cars in the driveway? These questions haunt the case like ghosts, unanswerable and eternal. In the end, 3 lives were destroyed on February 5th, 2015. Jim Tan's life ended in violence. Charlie Tan's future evaporated in seconds, and Jean Tan lost both her husband and her son, left to carry the weight of what happened in that house alone. The snow has long since melted from Coachside Lane. New families have moved into neighboring homes. Life in Pittsford has returned to its quiet, prosperous routine. But in a federal prison in upstate New York, a young man serves out his sentence, day by day living with the knowledge that he can never undo what he did, never reclaim the future that once seemed so bright. Then in the silence of whatever home she now occupies, Jean Tan lives with her own burdens. The memory of abuse, the loss of her husband, the absence of her son. Some crimes have clear heroes and villains. Others, like this one, have only victims and the devastating consequences of secrets kept too long. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that, while tragic, reminds us of the importance of vigilance, the power of family bonds, and the persistence of those who seek justice for the vulnerable. This is a true crime story, but it's told for rest, for reflection, in the quiet hours when we process the complexities of our world. Let the rhythm of the narrative carry you gently forward, as we remember a little boy named Blue, whose brief life mattered deeply to those who loved him. Take another breath, and let's begin. Monroe, Arkansas is the kind of place that barely registers on most maps. A small community nestled in Lee County, about an hour and a half west of Memphis, Tennessee. Monroe exists in that quintessentially American rural landscape where everybody knows everybody, where the pace of life moves slowly, and where neighbors wave to one another from porches that have stood for generations. The town sits in the Arkansas Delta region, where the land stretches flat and wide, where cotton fields once dominated the economy, and where the Mississippi River's influence can still be felt in the rich soil and humid summers. It's a place where Friday night football games bring out the whole town, where church on Sunday is as much about community as it is about faith, and where people tend to look out for one another. But like any place where humans live, Monroe holds its secrets. Behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors, life doesn't always follow the script of small-town tranquility. And in late 2022, Those closed doors would crack open to reveal a horror that would shake this quiet community to its core. The house in question sat unremarkable among the others. Just another home on just another street. Nothing about its exterior suggested the darkness that had taken root inside. Neighbors would later say they'd seen the family coming and going. A woman, her 2 children, and her boyfriend. Normal enough, or so it seemed. But normalcy, as we so often discover in these stories, can be a carefully maintained illusion. To understand what happened in that house in Morrow, we need to understand the people involved. And at the heart of this story is a little boy who would never reach his 6th birthday. His name was Blue Roland. Blow. Even his name evoked something gentle, something colorful. Born on December 16th, 2016, Blue came into a world that should have protected him, nurtured him, allowed him to grow into whoever he was meant to become. He had dark hair and eyes that family members remember as curious and bright. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary little boy with ordinary little boy interests and an ordinary little boy need for love and safety. Blue had an older sister. We'll call her Taylor, as her story is part of this narrative too. She survived what Blue did not. Taylor was 6 years old in December of 2022, just a year older than her brother. The 2 children shared a bond, as siblings often do, navigating the complexities of their young lives together. Their mother was Ashley Rowland, who was 28 years old at the time of these events. Ashley's life story, like many, held complications. She'd been married before to the children's father, Dustin Rowland, but that relationship had dissolved. The details of any marriage's end are always intricate, filled with the kind of nuances that outsiders can never fully grasp. What we know is that by 2022, Ashley and Dustin were separated, and a custody arrangement existed for the children. Ashley's parents, particularly the children's paternal grandmother, Karen Rowland, had been fighting for visitation rights with Blue and Taylor. These weren't the circumstances you'd hope for in any family. Grandparents having to go through legal channels just to see their grandchildren. But family dynamics are rarely simple, and the Rowland family was no exception. Then there was Nathan Bridges, 33 years old. Bridges had become Ashley's boyfriend, and by the summer of 2022, the family, Ashley, Blue, Taylor, and Bridges, had moved into the house in Morrow. The house, as it happens, belonged to Bridges, not Ashley. This detail would prove significant later. Neighbors noticed the family's arrival. A woman with 2 young children and her boyfriend. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that raised alarm bells. The children played outside sometimes. The adults came and went. Life appeared to proceed in its normal rhythms. But inside that house, in the privacy that walls and doors provide, something very different was unfolding. Summer turned to fall in 2022. The Arkansas heat gradually gave way to cooler temperatures. The school year began for children across the state, and in the house in Morrow, Blue and Taylor were becoming increasingly isolated from the outside world. The legal battle over visitation rights provides our first window into the growing dysfunction. Karen Rowland, the children's paternal grandmother, had been trying desperately to maintain contact with her grandchildren. This wasn't simply a matter of a grandmother wanting to spend time with her beloved grandkids, though that was certainly part of it. Karen sensed something was wrong. According to court records, her son Dustin Rowland had reopened a custody case in September of 2022, filing a complaint that alleged Ashley had failed and refused to allow visitation as ordered by the court. This wasn't an unusual situation in contentious custody arrangements, but the timing is notable. Dustin filed this complaint on September 14th. 5 days earlier, on September 9th, little Blue Rowland had died. Nobody outside that house knew it yet. Not Dustin, not Karen, not the authorities. The life of a 5-year-old boy had been extinguished. And the world continued on, unaware. The reasons for the isolation become clearer when we consider what was happening behind those closed doors. The children were being subjected to treatment that can only be described as torture, ferns, malnutrition, injuries that would make even the most hardened investigators recoil. An incident had occurred in the months before September that gives us insight into just how serious the situation had become. According to family members, Nathan Bridges had allegedly pulled a gun on Dustin Rowland, the children's father. The specifics of that confrontation aren't entirely clear, but the result was definitive. A lawyer advised the Rowland family not to go to the house, and so the children remained, cut off from the family members who might have saved them, trapped in an environment that was becoming increasingly dangerous with each passing day. September 9th, 2022 was a Friday. Whatever happened that day between Nathan Bridges and 5-year-old Blue would cost the child his life. The details that emerged later, in court documents and police affidavits, paint a picture so disturbing that it's difficult to process. But in the interest of understanding what happened, and in the interest of honoring Blue's memory, we must confront these facts. According to the account that Ashley Rowland would later give to investigators, the fatal incident began with something seemingly trivial. Nathan Bridges deliberately stuck his finger into Blue's mouth. The reason for this action remains unclear. Was it meant as a game, a taunt, an assertion of dominance? We may never know the answer. What we do know is that Blue did what many children might instinctively do when someone puts a finger in their mouth. Unexpectedly, he bit down. Bridges' response was swift and brutal. Enraged by the bite, he took the 5-year-old boy into the bathroom, and there, in what should be one of the most mundane rooms in any home, Nathan Bridges drowned Blue Rowland in the toilet. Let that image settle for a moment. A grown man, someone who should have been protecting this child, instead using his size and strength to hold a small boy's head underwater until the life left his body. The terror Blue must have felt in those final moments is almost unimaginable. Ashley Rowland told police that she did nothing to stop it. She admitted to investigators that she came into the bathroom afterward and found Blue struggling to breathe, his small body limp. The boy who had been alive and aware just minutes before was now dying, or already dead. And then came the cover-up. Death is only the beginning of this story. What happened next compounds the horror, transforming an already unthinkable act into something even more disturbing. Nathan Bridges made a decision. Whether this decision was made in panic, in cold calculation, or in some twisted combination of both, we cannot say, but he chose not to call for help, not to contact authorities, not to claim it was an accident, and face whatever consequences might follow. Instead, he decided to hide what he'd done. Bridges took Blue's body and concealed it beneath the floorboards of the house. The specifics of this process are grim. He dug into the earth beneath the home's floor. He placed the child's body there, wrapped in a red and blue blanket, along with a pair of flip-flop shoes. Then he covered everything with dirt and nailed new floorboards over the spot, sealing his secret beneath the very place where the family walked every day. Imagine living in a house, knowing that beneath your feet lies the body of a child you could have saved, but didn't. The psychological compartmentalization required to go about daily life under those circumstances is difficult to fathom. And Ashley Rowland went along with it, whether from fear, from complicity, or from some terrible combination of both. She helped maintain the fiction that Blue was simply elsewhere, with friends, with family, away. September turned to October. October became November. The leaves changed colors and fell from the trees. Halloween came and went. Thanksgiving approached, and beneath those floorboards, in the darkness and silence, lay the body of a 5-year-old boy who should have been learning to read, playing with toys, getting ready to start school. Meanwhile, life in the house continued, but it continued with a pattern of violence that could not remain hidden forever. While Blue lay hidden beneath the floor, his sister Taylor was enduring her own nightmare. The violence that had claimed Blue's life hadn't ended with his death. If anything, it had continued, perhaps even escalated. Court documents and medical records would later reveal the extent of Taylor's injuries. Burns covered her head, severe burns that doctors would later determine were caused when Nathan Bridges held the 6-year-old child under scalding hot water. This wasn't an accident, like a child getting burned reaching for a hot stove. This was deliberate, punishment, as Bridges himself would later characterize it, for behavior issues. The burns were extensive enough to cause severe scabbing. The pain must have been excruciating, and when those scabs formed, more injuries appeared. Puncture wounds that looked as if scissors had been used to pierce the skin on her head. Marks around her neck, consistent with strangulation, bite marks on her legs. Several fractured ribs. An old leg injury that had healed incorrectly because it had never received proper medical attention. Taylor's body had become a canvas of abuse, each injury telling its own story of violence and neglect. Medical professionals who examined her would later discover she was severely malnourished, weighing just 36 pounds at age 6, significantly underweight for a child her age. How does a child survive such treatment? What reserves of strength and resilience must a 6-year-old summon to endure day after day of pain, hunger, and fear? We can only imagine Taylor somehow held on, her small body battered but her spirit unbroken, until the day when help would finally arrive. That day came in December, 3 months after her brother's death. 3 months of living in a house with Blue's body hidden beneath the floor. 3 months of additional abuse and suffering. But December 16th, 2022 would be different. Karen Rowland had never stopped fighting for her grandchildren. Through legal channels, through court orders, through sheer determination, she had finally secured the right to see Blue and Taylor again. A court order for visitation had been granted, and on December 16th, she was coming to the house in Morrow to pick up the children. December 16th. The day carries significance. It was Blue's birthday. He would have turned 6 years old that day. Instead, he had been dead for 3 months. Though Karen didn't know that yet, she was coming to celebrate with him. To see him and his sister, to perhaps spend some normalcy with the grandchildren she'd been kept from for so long. When Karen arrived at the house on that Friday evening, she expected to be greeted by 2 children. Instead, Ashley brought out only Taylor. The moment Karen saw her granddaughter, she knew something was terribly wrong. The little girl had visible injuries, scabs on her head that had formed over burns. But Ashley had an explanation ready. Allergic reaction, she claimed. Nothing to worry about. Karen wasn't buying it. Her grandmother knows her grandchildren. She knows when something is wrong, and she could hear Taylor whimpering inside the house. The sound of a child in pain is unmistakable. And Karen had heard it before Ashley brought the girl out. I heard Taylor whimpering, Karen would later tell reporters. Of course I didn't know what was going on, and I bust through the door myself because I didn't like the whimpering. Sounded like she was hurting. The scene that confronted Karen when she burst through that door defies easy description. Her granddaughter clearly injured, clearly suffering. Her grandson nowhere to be seen. And Ashley Rowland offering explanations that didn't add up. Karen made the decision that would ultimately bring this horror to light. She took Taylor from the house. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't accept the explanations. She grabbed her granddaughter and got her to safety, rushing her to the hospital in Forest City. At the hospital, medical professionals immediately recognized that they weren't looking at allergic reactions. They were looking at abuse, severe burns, malnutrition, multiple injury. Taylor was quickly transferred to Le Bonaire Children's Hospital in Memphis, where she could receive specialized care. And Karen? Karen knew that if Taylor was in this condition, something must have happened to Blue. She called other family members. They went to the house in Morrow. They confronted Ashley and Nathan, and eventually the truth began to emerge. There's a moment in many true crime stories where the facade finally cracks, where the pretense becomes impossible to maintain, where the weight of guilt or the pressure of confrontation forces the truth into the light. For Ashley Rowland and Nathan Bridges, that moment came on December 16th, 2022, when family members arrived at the house and began asking questions, demanding questions that wouldn't accept vague non-answers. Something shifted. Maybe it was the realization that Taylor's condition would raise inevitable questions. Maybe it was simple exhaustion from carrying the secret for 3 months. Maybe it was the confrontation itself. The presence of angry, grieving family members who weren't going to leave without answer. According to family accounts, Ashley and Nathan eventually confessed. They admitted that Blue was dead. They called it an accident, that word people often use to minimize, to suggest that what happened wasn't intended, wasn't as bad as it seems. But this was no accident. Ashley told family members where to find Blue's body. She gave them the details. The bathroom, the toilet, the burial beneath the floorboards. And at some point during this horrific revelation, someone called the police. Karen Rowland, speaking with investigators, shared what she'd learned. Her grandson wasn't with friends. He wasn't staying with relatives. He was buried under the floor of the house in Morrow. He had been there for 3 months, and he died on September 9th, which was 5 days before her son Dustin had filed the motion to reopen the custody case. The Lee County Sheriff's Office received the call and immediately requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police Criminal Investigation Division. Deputies and special agents converged on the house in Morrow at approximately 10:45 that night. They arrived at a scene that would haunt even experienced investigators. The approach to such a scene requires both professionalism and emotional fortitude. Law enforcement officers know intellectually what their job entails. They understand that they will encounter death, that they will witness humanity at its worst. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are two different things. The deputies entered the house with information about where Blue's body might be located. They examined the floor, looking for signs of disturbance, and they found them newly nailed boards in the hallway, different from the surrounding flooring, indicating recent work. The process of removing those boards must have felt surreal. Each nail pulled, each board lifted, brought them closer to confirming what they'd been told. And when the boards came up, they saw disturbed earth beneath, soil that had been dug up and replaced within the past several months. They began carefully removing the top layer of earth, and then they saw them, a child's flip-flop shoes, red and blue fabric, a blanket. At that point, according to the official reports, the smell became overwhelming, a pungent odor of decay that forced everyone in the house to evacuate. The smell of death is distinctive, unmistakable. Those who've encountered it describe it as something that stays with you, that you can't forget no matter how much you might want to. The full excavation would be completed with the assistance of additional personnel and equipment. And when they finally uncovered what lay beneath those floorboards, they found exactly what Karen Rowland had told them they'd find. The body of Blue Rowland, 5 years old, dead for 3 months, hidden in the darkness beneath the home where he should have been safe, where he should have been loved, where he should have been allowed to grow up. December 16th, 2022. Blue's 6th birthday, the day he should have been blowing out candles and opening presents. Instead, it was the day his body was found. The day his death was finally revealed. The day the investigation into his murder officially began. Ashley Rowland and Nathan Bridges were arrested on December 17th, 2022, the day after Blue's body was discovered. Both were taken into custody and transported to detention facilities in Lee County. The charges filed against them reflected the severity of their crimes. Both faced capital murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, endangering the welfare of a minor, and battery. Ashley faced 2 additional felony charges of permitting child abuse, reflecting her failure to protect her children from Bridges' violence. The mugshot taken of Ashley at the time of her arrest shows a woman with a visible black eye. The source of that injury remains unclear, but it adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Was this injury evidence that Ashley herself was a victim of Bridges' violence, or had she sustained it during the confrontation with family members? We don't have definitive answers. Nathan Bridges declined to be interviewed by investigators. He invoked his right to remain silent, as is his legal prerogative. But Ashley provided a statement, and it was from her account that many of the details of Blue's death emerged. She described the incident in the bathroom, the finger in Blue's mouth, the bite, the drowning. She admitted that she'd witnessed her son struggling to breathe, his body limp, and had done nothing to help him. She described how Bridges had buried the body and how she'd helped maintain the cover story. She also told investigators about the abuse Taylor had suffered, how Bridges had held the 6-year-old under scalding water as punishment, how the burns had formed and scabbed, how the violence had continued, unchecked and unabated, while a dead child lay beneath their feet. The legal process moved forward. Both suspects had probable cause hearings. Both were appointed public defenders, and both were held without bond as they awaited trial. The community of Morrow, meanwhile, was reeling. Neighbors like Glenda Farrell, who lived just feet away from the house, struggled to process what had happened right next door. "You're living right here, and it's right under your nose, and you don't see anything out of the ordinary," she told reporters. The guilt and confusion that comes from such proximity to horror is a heavy burden to bear. While the legal machinery ground forward, Taylor Rowland was in Memphis, receiving treatment at Le Bon Air Children's Hospital. The injuries she'd sustained were extensive. 2nd and 3rd degree burns, fractured ribs, malnutrition, the psychological trauma of witnessing her brother's death and enduring months of abuse. Children are remarkably resilient, but resilience has its limits. The physical wounds would heal with time and proper medical care. The psychological scars would require years of therapy and support. The loss of her brother, the betrayal by her mother, the violence she'd experienced. These things don't simply go away. The community rallied around Taylor in the way that small communities often do when tragedy strikes. A GoFundMe campaign was established to help with medical expenses and to provide for Taylor's future care. Within days it had raised over $24,000. Donations also flowed in through First National Bank, designated specifically for Taylor's care and Blue's burial. The outpouring reflected the horror people felt at what had happened. It represented a collective desire to do something, anything, to help. Money couldn't undo the damage that had been done. Couldn't bring Blue back, couldn't erase Taylor's trauma, but it was what people could offer, and so they offered it. Karen Rowland, who had fought so hard for visitation rights, who had literally burst through a door to save her granddaughter, now faced the task of helping Taylor heal. The little girl would need stability, love, therapy, and time. So much time, and she would need to process the loss of her brother. Blue, who had been her companion through their short lives together. Blue, who had been murdered while she survived. Survivor's guilt is a real and powerful force, and Taylor would have to contend with it as she grew older and came to understand more fully what had happened in that house in Morrow. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in this case they did turn. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions were documented. The physical evidence, Blue's body, Taylor's injuries, the burial site beneath the floor told a story that couldn't be denied. For 19 months, Ashley Rowland and Nathan Bridges remained in custody as their cases proceeded through the court system. Ashley was held in St. Francis County, Bridges in Lee County. Both awaited trial on multiple felony charges that could result in decades in prison. Then in July of 2024, Nathan Bridges made a decision. On July 15th, he stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and first-degree battery. The guilty plea meant he was accepting responsibility for Blue's death and for the injuries inflicted on Taylor. The sentence was severe, but perhaps not surprising. 60 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. 60 years for a life that lasted only 5. 60 years for violence against children who were defenseless and vulnerable. 60 years, which means that Bridges, who was 34 years old at sentencing, would be 94 years old before he could potentially be released. Is that justice? The question is impossible to answer definitively. And no sentence can bring Blue back. No amount of prison time can undo the trauma Taylor experienced, but 60 years removes a dangerous individual from society and acknowledges the profound wrongness of what was done. A month later, in August of 2024, Ashley Rowland had also stood before a judge. Her case was somewhat different from Bridges. She hadn't directly killed Blue. That was Bridges' act, but she had failed to protect him. She had failed to protect Taylor. She had participated in the cover-up. She had permitted the abuse to continue. On August 8th, Ashley pleaded guilty to 2 counts of permitting abuse of a minor. The court sentenced her to 40 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. 40 years for failing to be the one thing she was supposed to be above all else. A mother who protected her children. The sentences were handed down. The defendants were transported to prison. The case in legal terms was closed, but closure and justice are not always the same thing. Every true crime case leaves questions in its wake. Some can be answered through investigation and evidence. Others remain mysteries that will never be fully resolved. In the case of Blue Rowland, we know the basic facts. We know what happened, who was responsible, and what the consequences were. But the deeper questions, the why questions that haunt us, those are more elusive. Why did Nathan Bridges react with such extreme violence to a child's instinctive reaction? What in his background, his psychology, his worldview made him capable of drowning a 5-year-old boy for biting his finger? The records don't provide a full picture of Bridges' life before these events, but clearly something was deeply, dangerously wrong. Why did Ashley Rowland fail to protect her children? This question is perhaps even more troubling. Mothers are supposed to be the ultimate protectors of their offspring. It's one of the most fundamental relationships in human society. What happened to override that instinct? Was she afraid of Bridges? Was she complicit in a worldview that saw children as objects to be controlled, rather than people to be nurtured? Was she so damaged herself that she couldn't fulfill the role she'd taken on? The black eye in her mugshot suggests she may have been a victim of domestic violence herself. If so, does that explain, if not excuse, her failure to protect Blue and Taylor? The dynamics of abusive relationships are complex. Victims often feel trapped, paralyzed, unable to escape or to seek help. But at what point does being a victim yourself cease to excuse allowing your children to be victimized? These are not comfortable questions, and they don't have comfortable answers. Then there are the systemic questions. Dustin Rowland, the children's father, had reopened the custody case in September, just days after Blue's death. He'd been fighting for access to his children. Why didn't the system work faster? Why were there obstacles to visitation that kept concerned family members away from children who desperately needed intervention? Karen Rowland had been fighting for visitation rights for months. She sensed something was wrong. She persisted in seeking access to her grandchildren. But it took a court order, legal channels, precious time during which Blue died and Taylor suffered. Could this tragedy have been prevented? It's impossible to say with certainty, but the question demands to be asked. Were there warning signs that were missed? Were there opportunities for intervention that weren't taken? In hindsight, with the full knowledge of what happened, it's easy to see all the points where things might have gone differently. But in the moment when information is incomplete and people are making decisions based on what they know, the picture is always less clear. The neighbor Glenda Farrell expressed the confusion that so many people feel in the aftermath of such revelations. You're living right here and it's right under your nose and you don't see anything out of the ordinary. How often does evil hide behind a facade of normalcy? How often do horrors unfold behind closed doors while the world outside continues its regular rhythms? Unaware, these cases force us to confront the limits of what we can know about others' lives, and the difficulty of identifying abuse when those who perpetrate it are skilled at concealment. In the midst of all the horror, all the legal proceedings, all the questions and systemic failures, it's crucial that we not lose sight of the central figure in this story, Blue Rowland himself. He was 5 years old. He liked to play, as all children do. He had dark hair and bright eyes. He had a sister he cared about. He had grandparents who loved him desperately and fought to see him. He had a father who, whatever his own struggles, wanted to be part of his life. Blue was not just a victim. He was not just a statistic in the grim tally of child abuse cases. He was a person, a small person, certainly, one whose personality was still forming, whose potential remained largely unrealized, but a person nonetheless, with thoughts and feelings and experiences and a future that should have stretched out before him for decades. What might Blue have become if he'd been allowed to grow up? Would he have been good at sports or music or math? Would he have been funny or serious or somewhere in between? Would he have gone to college, started a career, fallen in love, had children of his own? We'll never know, because all of that potential was snuffed out in a bathroom on September 9th, 2022. His birthday, December 16th, takes on a poignant significance. He was born on that date in 2016. He would have turned 6 on that date in 2022. Instead, December 16th became the day his body was discovered, the day the world learned what had been done to him. Every year now, December 16th will mark both his birth and the revelation of his death. It's a date that those who loved him will never be able to ignore, never be able to escape. The GoFundMe established in the aftermath of these events raised money for Taylor's care and Blue's burial. That second purpose, the burial, reminds us that even in death, Blue required the community's support. His short life deserved to be honored with a proper farewell, and the community provided that. Where is he buried now? What does his gravestone say? These details aren't part of the public record, and perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps Blue deserves some privacy in death that he was denied in life. Perhaps those who loved him deserve a place where they can grieve without the intrusion of public curiosity. What we can say is that Blue Rowland mattered. His life, though brief, had value. His death was a tragedy that should never have occurred, and his memory serves as a reminder of why we must remain vigilant, why we must take seriously the signs of child abuse, why we must act when we suspect a child is in danger. Blue Rowland's case is not unique, and that might be the most disturbing aspect of all. Every year, Hundreds of children die from abuse and neglect in the United States alone. The exact numbers are difficult to pin down. Many cases go unreported, misclassified, or unrecognized. But even conservative estimates are sobering. Children are particularly vulnerable to abuse because they depend entirely on adults for their survival and well-being. They often don't understand that what's happening to them is wrong. They may blame themselves, they may not know how to seek help, or may be prevented from doing so by their abusers. In cases of abuse within families, the dynamics become even more complex. The people who are supposed to protect children are instead the ones harming them. The home, which should be a sanctuary, becomes a prison, and outsiders who might intervene if they knew what was happening are kept in the dark by walls, doors, and the abuser's efforts to maintain a facade of normalcy. Warning signs of child abuse include unexplained injuries, fearfulness around certain people, regression in behavior, poor hygiene or malnourishment, and reluctance to go home. But these signs aren't always present or obvious. Abusers can be skilled at hiding evidence, at coaching children to lie, at presenting themselves as loving parents to the outside world. What can be done? The answer is complex and involves multiple levels of intervention. Better funding for child protective services, more training for teachers, doctors, and others who interact with children regularly, stronger legal protections for children, and clearer paths for family members who suspect abuse. Public awareness campaigns that help people recognize the signs and understand their obligations to report. But perhaps most important is a shift in cultural attitudes. We need to move away from the idea that what happens in a family is entirely private, that parents have absolute authority over their children, that outside interference is always inappropriate. Yes, there's a balance to be struck. We don't want a surveillance state where every parenting decision is scrutinized. But we also need to recognize that children are people with rights, and those rights sometimes require protection from their own families. The case of Blue Roland shows us the cost of failure. It shows us what happens when warning signs are missed, when barriers to intervention are too high, when concerned family members are kept at a distance for too long. It also shows us the importance of persistence. Karen Rowland didn't give up. She fought for visitation rights. She went to the house when she had the legal authority to do so. She acted when she saw her granddaughter in distress. Her actions came too late to save Blue, but they saved Taylor and brought the perpetrators to justice. That's not nothing. In a story filled with darkness, Karen Rowland's determination represents a point of light. And so we come to the end of this story. Not because the story itself is truly over. Taylor is still healing, still growing, still processing what happened to her and her brother. The community of Morrow is still coming to terms with the horror that unfolded in their midst. The broader questions about child protection and systemic failures remain unresolved. But the narrative arc of Blue Roland's case, from his tragic death to the discovery of his body to the conviction and sentencing of those responsible, has reached its conclusion. The legal chapter is closed. What remains is memory and meaning. Take a moment now to breathe deeply. You've accompanied me through a difficult story, one that challenges our assumptions about safety and family and the protection of the vulnerable. These are not easy topics. They leave us unsettled, questioning, perhaps even a bit frightened. But they're important. They're important because they remind us that evil exists, that it can hide in plain sight, that vigilance and courage are necessary to protect those who cannot protect themselves. They're important because they honor the memory of children like Blue, whose stories deserve to be told not just as cautionary tales, but as reminders of lives that had value, even if those lives were cut tragically short. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.